Welcome back to Paper Cuts, everyone. The last time we left off, we ended at a chapter boundary, and we're just gonna get right back into it with chapter 21 in Oxford Street. In going downstairs the first time, I found an unexpected difficulty because I couldn't see my feet. Indeed, I stumbled twice, and there was an unaccustomed clumsiness in gripping the bolt. By not looking down, however, I managed to walk on the level passably well. My mood, I say, was one of exaltation. I felt as a seeing man might do, with padded feet and noiseless clothes, in a city of the blind. I experienced a wild impulse to jest, to startle people, to clap men on the back, fling people's hats astray, and generally revel in my extraordinary advantage. But hardly had I emerged upon Great Portland Street, however, my lodging was close to the big draper's shop there, when I heard a clashing concussion and was hit violently behind, and turned and saw a man carrying a basket of soda water siphons and looking in amazement at his burden. Although the blow had really hurt me, I found something so irresistible in his astonishment I laughed aloud. "The devil's in the basket," I said, and suddenly twisted it out of his hand. He let go incontinently, and I swung the whole weight into the air. But a fool of a cabman standing outside a public house made a sudden rush for this, and his extending fingers took me with excruciating violence under the ear. I let the whole down with a smash on the cabman, and then with shouts and the clatter of feet about me, people coming out of shops, vehicles pulling up, I realized what I had done for myself, and, cursing my folly, backed against a shop window and prepared to dodge out of the confusion. In a moment I should be wedged into a crowd and inevitably discovered. I pushed by a butcher boy who luckily didn't turn to see the nothingness that shoved him aside, and dodged behind the cabman's four-wheeler. I don't know how they settled the business. I hurried straight across the road, which was happily clear, and, hardly heeding which way I went, in the fright of detection the incident had given me, plunged into the afternoon throng of Oxford Street. I tried to get into the stream of people, but they were too thick for me, and in a moment my heels were being trodden upon. I took to the gutter, the roughness of which I found painful to my feet, and forthwith the shaft of a crawling hansom dug me forcibly under the shoulder-blade, reminding me that I was already bruised severely. I staggered out of the way of a cab, avoided a perambulator by a convulsive moment, and found myself behind the hansom. A happy thought saved me, and this drove slowly along, as I followed in its immediate wake, trembling and astonished at the turn of my adventure. And not only trembling, but shivering. It was a bright day in January, and I was stark naked. The thin slime of mud that covered the road was freezing. Foolish as it seems to me now, I hadn't reckoned that, transparent or not, I was still amenable to the weather and all its consequences. Then suddenly a bright idea came into my head. I ran round and got into the cab, and so, shivering, scared, and sniffing, with the first intimations of a cold, and with the bruises in the small of my back growing upon my attention, I drove slowly upon Oxford Street and past Tottenham Court Road. My mood was as different from that in which I had sallied forth 10 minutes ago as My mood was as different from that in which I had sallied forth 10 minutes ago as it is possible to imagine. This invisibility, indeed. The one thought that possessed me was, how was I to get out of the scrape I was in? We crawled past Muddy's, and there a tall woman with 5 or 6 yellow-labeled books hailed my cab, and I sprang out just in time to escape her, shaving a railway van narrowly in my flight. I made off up the roadway to Bloomsbury Square, intending to strike north past the museum and so get into the quiet district. I was now cruelly chilled, and the strangest of my situations so unnerved me that I whimpered as I ran. At the northward corner of the square, a little white dog ran out of the Pharmaceutical Society's offices and incontinently made for me, nose down. I had never realized it before, but the nose is to the mind of a dog what the eye is to the mind of a seeing man. Dogs perceive the scent of a man moving as men perceive his vision. And so this brute began barking and leaping, showing, as it seemed to me, only too plainly that he was aware of me. I crossed Great Russell Street, glancing over my shoulder as I did so, and went some way along Montague Street before I realized what I was running toward. Then I became aware of a blare of music, and looking along the street saw a number of people advancing out of Russell Square, red shirts and with the banner of the Salvation Army to the fore. Such a crowd, chanting in the roadway and scoffing on the pavement, I couldn't hope to penetrate it. I dreaded to go back and farther from home again. So decided, on the spur of the moment, I ran up the white steps of a house facing the museum railings, and stood there until the crowd should have passed. Happily the dog stopped at the noise of the band too, hesitated, and turned tail, running back to Bloomsbury Square again. On came the band, bawling with unconscious irony some hymn about when we shall see his face, and it seemed an indeterminable amount of time to me before the tide of the crowd washed along the pavement by me. Thud, thud, thud came the drum with a vibrating resonance, and for the moment I didn't notice two urchins stopping at the railings by me. "See 'em," said one. "See what?" "Why, them footmarks, bare, like what you makes in mud." I looked down and saw the youngsters had stopped and were gaping at the muddy footmarks I had left behind me up the newly whitened steps. The passing people elbowed and jostled them, but their confounded intelligence was arrested. Thud, thud, thud. When, thud, shall we see, thud, his face, thud, thud. "There's a barefoot man gone up them steps, or I don't know nothing, and he ain't never come down again, and his foot was a-bleeding." At this point the thick of the crowd had already passed. "Looky there, Tad," quoth the younger of the detectives, with the sharpness of surprise in his voice, and pointed straight to my feet. I looked down and saw at once the dim suggestion of their outline, splayed and splashes of mud, and for a moment I was paralyzed. "Well, that's rum. It's just like the ghost of a foot, isn't it?" He hesitated and advanced with outstretched hand, and a man pulled up short to see what he was catching, and then a girl. In a moment he would have touched me, and then I saw what to do. I made a step, and the boy started back with an exclamation, and with a rapid movement I swung myself over into the portico of the next house. But the smaller boy was sharp-eyed enough to follow the movement, and before I was well down the steps and upon the pavement, he had recovered from his momentary astonishment, and was shouting that the feet had gone over the wall. At this they rushed around and saw my new footmarks flash into being on the lower step and upon the pavement. "What's up? Feet! Look! Feet running!" Everybody in the road, except my 3 pursuers, were pouring along after the Salvation Army, and this blow not only impeded me, but them. There was an eddy of surprise and interrogation, and at the cost of bowling over one young fellow I got through, and in another moment I was rushing headlong round the circuit of Russell Square, with 6 or 7 astonished people following my footmarks. There was no time for explanation, or else the whole host would have been after me. And so twice I doubled round corners, thrice I crossed the road and came back upon my tracks, and then as my feet grew hot and dry, the damp impressions began to fade. At last I had a breathing space, and rubbed my feet clean with my hands, and so got away altogether. The last I saw of the chase was a little group of a dozen people, perhaps, studying with infinite perplexity a slowly drying footprint that had resulted from a puddle in Tavistock Square, a footprint as isolated and incomprehensible to them as Crusoe's solitary discovery. This running warmed me to a certain extent, and I went on with a better courage through the maze of less frequented roads that run hereabouts. My back had now become very stiff and sore, and my tonsils were painful from the cabman's fingers, and the skin of my neck had been scratched by his nails. My feet hurt exceedingly, and I was lame from a little cut on one of them. I saw in time a blind man approaching me, and fled limping, for I feared his subtle intuitions. Once or twice accidental collisions occurred, and I left people amazed with unaccountable curses ringing in their ears. And then came something silent and quiet across my face, and across the square fell a thin veil of slowly falling flakes of snow. I had caught cold already, and do as I would, I could not avoid an occasional sneeze, and every dog that came in sight with its pointing nose and curious sniffing was a terror to me. And then came men and boys running, first one and then others, and shouting as they ran. It was a fire. They ran in the direction of my lodging, and looking back down the street, I saw a mass of black smoke streaming up above the roofs and telephone wires. It was my lodging burning. My clothes, my apparatus, all my resources indeed, except my checkbook and the 3 volumes of memoranda that awaited me in Great Portland Street. They were there, burning. I had burnt my boats, if ever a man did. The place was blazing. And at this the Invisible Man paused and thought, and Kemp glanced nervously out the window. Yes? Go on. I should make clear before starting in on Chapter 22, since this next section, as I remember it, it's been many years since I've read this book, but this next section, as I remember it, is a very long monologue of, the Invisible Man telling his story, and the Invisible Man's voice, while a very good voice for the Invisible Man, very, oh, I can't believe you've done this, Ooh, you see, you can hear it a little bit in my voice when I did that. I can't believe you've done this. Oh, it strains my vocal cords because not only am I pitching my voice down, which it doesn't necessarily strain my vocal cords being a bass, but I'm pitching my voice down and I'm putting a little more force into my speaking than I normally do. And the extra force of speaking is what really kills me, and I don't think I can do this for that voice for how long this monologue is. So I'm just gonna do this in my ordinary reading voice, and I'll make it clear if I'll read all of the the person said, the Invisible Man said, Kemp said, to make it clear who's speaking, because I'm just gonna kind of ease off on the character voices this time around since it's mostly monologues. I just wanted to make that clear. For the rest of the episode, I'm probably going to do that. Just for the sake of my voice, Sometimes you gotta take a rest. Whew. Anyway, Chapter 22, in the Emporium. So, last January, with the beginning of a snowstorm in the air... Oh, pardon me. Whatever I ate most recently is not settling well with me, so that may be something you have to bear in this episode as well. Anyway, so last January, with the beginning of a snowstorm in the air about me, and if it settled on me, it'd betray me. Weary, cold, painful, inexpressibly wretched, and still but half convinced of my invisible quality, I began this new life to which I'm committed. I had no refuge, no appliances, no human being in the world in whom I could confide. To have told my secret would have given me away, made a mere show and rarity of me. But nevertheless I was half-minded to accost some passer-by and throw myself upon his mercy. But I knew too clearly the terror and brutal cruelty my advances would evoke, and so I made no plans in the street. My sole object was to get shelter from the snow, to get myself covered and warm. Then I might hope to plan. But even to me, an invisible man, the rows of London houses stood latched, barred, and bolted impregnably. Only one thing could I see clearly before me, the cold exposure and misery of the snowstorm and the night. And then I had a brilliant idea. I turned down one of the roads leading from Gower Street to Tottenham Court Road, and found myself outside Omnium's, the big establishment where everything's to be bought. You know the place: meat, grocery, linen, furniture, clothing, oil paintings even. A huge meandering collection of shops rather than a singular shop. I thought I should find the doors open, but they were closed, and as I stood in the wide entrance a carriage stopped outside, and a man in uniform, you know the kind of personage with Omnium on his cap, flung open the door. I contrived to enter, and walking down the shop, it was a department where they were selling ribbons and gloves and stockings and that kind of thing, came to a more spacious region, devoted to picnic baskets and wicker furniture. I didn't feel safe there, however. People were going to and fro, and I prowled restlessly about until I came upon a huge section in an upper floor, containing multitudes of bedsteads, and over these I clambered, and found a resting place at last, among a huge pile of folded flock mattresses. The place was already lit up and agreeably warm, and I decided to remain where I was, keeping a cautious eye on the 2 or 3 sets of shopmen and customers who were meandering through the place until closing time came. Then I should be able, I thought, to rob the place for food and clothing, and, disguised, prowl through it and examine its resources, perhaps sleep on some of the bedding. That seemed an acceptable plan. My idea was to procure clothing to make myself a muffled but acceptable figure, to get money, and then to recover my books and parcels where they awaited me, take a lodging somewhere, and elaborate plans for the complete realization of the advantages my invisibility gave me, as I still imagined, over my fellow men. Closing time arrived quickly enough. It couldn't have been more than an hour after I took up my position on the mattresses before I noticed the blinds of the windows being drawn and customers being marched doorward. And then a number of brisk young men began with remarkable alacrity to tidy up the goods that remained disturbed. I left my lair as the crowds diminished and prowled cautiously out into the less desolate parts of the shop. I was really surprised to observe how rapidly the young men and women whipped away the goods displayed for sale during the day. All the boxes of goods, the hanging fabrics, the festoons of lace, boxes of sweets in the grocery section, the displays of this and that and the other were being whipped down, folded up, and slapped into tidy receptacles, and everything that couldn't be taken down and put away had sheets of some coarse stuff like sacking flung over them. Finally, all the chairs were turned up upon the counters, leaving the floor clear. Directly each of these young people had done, he or she had made promptly for the door with such an expression of animation as I have rarely observed in a shop assistant before. Then came a lot of youngsters scattering sawdust and carrying pails and brooms. I had to dodge out of the way, and as it was, my ankle got stung with the sawdust. For some time, as I was wandering through the swathed and darkened departments, I could hear the brooms at work. And at last, a good hour or more after the shop had been closed, came a noise of locking doors. Silence finally came upon the place, and I found myself wandering through the vast and intricate shops, galleries, showrooms of the place, alone. It was very still, and in one place I remember passing near one of the Tottenham Court Road entrances and listening to the tapping of boot heels of the passers-by. My first visit was to the place where I had seen stockings and gloves for sale. It was dark, and I had the devil of a hunt after matches, which I found at last in the drawer of the little cash desk. And then I had to get a candle. I had to tear down wrappings and ransack a number of boxes and drawers, but at last I managed to turn out what I sought. The box label called them lamb's wool pants and lamb's wool vests. And then socks, a thick comforter. Then I went to the clothing place and got trousers, a lounge jacket, an overcoat, and a slouch hat, a clerical sort of hat with the brim turned down. I began to feel as though I was a human being again, and my next thought quickly became food. Upstairs there was a refreshment department, and there I got cold meat. There was coffee still in the urn, and I lit the gas and warmed it up again, and altogether I didn't do badly. Afterwards, prowling through the place in search of blankets, I had to put up at last with a heap of down quilts. I came upon a grocery section with a lot of chocolate and candied fruits, more than was good for me indeed, and some white burgundy. And near that was a toy department, and I had a brilliant idea. I found some artificial noses, dummy noses, you know, and I thought of dark spectacles, but Omniums had no optical department. My nose had been a difficulty indeed. I had thought of paint, but discovery set my mind running on wigs and masks and the like. And then finally I went to sleep in a heap of down quilts, very warm and comfortable. My last thoughts before sleeping were the most agreeable I'd had since the change. I was in a state of physical serenity, and that was reflected in my mind. I thought that I should be able to slip out unobserved in the morning with my clothes upon me, muffling my face with a white wrapper I'd taken, purchase with the money I had taken, spectacles and so forth, and so complete my disguise. I lapsed into disorderly dreams of all the fantastic things that had happened during the last few days, and I saw the ugly landlord vociferating in his room. I saw his 2 sons marveling, and the wrinkled old woman's gnarled face as she asked for her cat. I experienced again the strange sensation of seeing the cloth disappear, and so I came round to the windy hillside, and the sniffling old clergyman, mumbling earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, at my father's open grave. "You also," said a voice, and suddenly I was being forced toward the grave. I struggled and shouted, appealed to the mourners, but they continued stonily following the service. The old clergyman, too, never faltered, droning and sniffing through the ritual. I realized that I was invisible and inaudible, that an overwhelming force had had its grip on me. I struggled in vain. I was forced over the brink. The coffin rang hollow as I fell upon it, and the gravel came flying after me in spadefuls. Nobody heeded me. Nobody was aware of me. I made convulsive struggles and awoke. The pale London dawn had come. The place was full of a chilly grey light that filtered round the edges of the window blinds, and I sat up. And for a time I couldn't think where this sample apartment, with its counters, its piles of rolled stuff, its heaps of quilts and cushions, its iron pillars, might be, and then as recollection came back to me I heard voices in conversation. And then far down the place, in the brighter light of some department which had already raised its blinds, I saw 2 men approaching. I scrambled to my feet, glancing about for some way of escape, and even as I did so, the sound of my movement made them aware of me. I suppose they merely saw a figure moving quietly and quickly away. "Who's that? Stop there!" shouted one and then the other. I dashed around a corner and came full tilt, a faceless figure, mind you, on a lanky lad of 15. He yelled, and I bowled him over, rushed past him, turned another corner, and by a happy inspiration threw myself behind the counter. In another moment feet went running past, and I heard voices shouting, "All hands to the doors!" asking what was up, and giving one another advice on how to catch me. Lying on the ground, I felt scared out of my wits. But odd as it may seem, it didn't occur to me at the moment to take off my clothes as I should have done. I had made up my mind, I suppose, to get away in them, and that ruled me. And then down the vista of counters came a bawling of, "There he is!" I sprang to my feet, whipped a chair off the counter, and sent it whirling at the fool who had shouted, turned, came up into another, round a corner, sent him spinning, and rushed up the stairs. He kept his footing, gave a view hello, and came up the staircase hot after me. Up the staircase were piled a multitude of those bright-colored pot things. What are they? Art pots, suggested Kemp. That's it, art pots. Well, I turned at the top step and swung round, plucked one out of a pile, and smashed it onto his head as he came at me. The whole pile of pots went headlong, and I heard shouting and footsteps running from all parts. I made a mad rush for the refreshment place, and there was a man in white, like a man-cook, who had taken up the chase. I made one last desperate turn, and found myself among lamps and ironmongery. I went behind the counter at this, and waited for the cook, and as he bolted in at the head of the chase, I doubled him up with the lamp. Down he went, and I crouched down behind the counter, and began whipping off my clothes as fast as I could. Coat, jacket, trousers. Shoes were all right, but a lamb's wool vest fits a man like a skin. I heard more men coming. My cook was lying quiet on the other side of the counter, stunned or scared speechless, and I had to make another dash for it, like a rabbit hunted out of a woodpile. "This way, policeman!" I heard someone shouting. I found myself in my bedstead storeroom again, and at the end of a wilderness of wardrobes. I rushed among them, went flat, and got rid of my vest after infinite wriggling, and stood a free man again, panting and scared, as the policeman and 3 of the shopmen came round the corner. They made a rush for the vest and pants, and collared the trousers. "He's dropping his plunder. He must be here somewhere," said one of the young men. But they didn't find me all the same. I stood watching them hunt me for a time, and then cursing my ill luck in losing the clothes. Then I went to the refreshment room, drank a little milk I found there, and sat down by the fire to consider my position. In a little while 2 assistants came in and began to talk over the business very excitedly, and like the fools they were. I heard a magnified account of my depredations and other speculations as to my whereabouts. Then I fell to scheming again. The insurmountable difficulty of the place, especially now that it was alarmed, was to get any plunder out of it. I went down into the warehouse to see if there was any chance of packing and addressing a parcel, but I couldn't understand the system of checking. About 11 o'clock, the snow having thawed as it fell, and the day being finer and a little warmer than the previous one, I decided that the Emporium was hopeless, and went out again, exasperated at my want of success, with only the vaguest plan of action in my mind. Chapter 23. In Drury Lane. "But now you begin to realize," said the Invisible Man, "the full disadvantage of my condition. I had no shelter, no covering. To get clothing was to forego all my advantage, to make myself a strange and terrible thing. I was fasting, for to eat to fill myself with unassimilated matter would be to become grotesquely visible again." "I never thought of that," said Kemp. "And neither had I. The snow had warned me of other dangers. I could not go abroad in snow. It would settle on me and expose me. Rain, too, would make a watery outline, a glistening surface of a man, a bubble. And fog? I should be like a fainter bubble in a fog, a surface, a greasy glimmer of humanity. Moreover, as I went abroad in the London air, I gathered dirt about my ankles, floating smuts and dust upon my skin. I didn't know how long it would be before I should become visible from that cause also. But I saw clearly it couldn't be for long. At least not in London at any rate. Not in London at any rate. I went into the slums toward Great Portland Street, and found myself at the end of the street in which I had lodged. I didn't go that way, because of the crowd, halfway down it, opposite to the still smoking ruins of the house I had fired. My most immediate problem was to get clothing. What to do with my face puzzled me. And then I saw in one of those little miscellaneous shops, news, sweets, toys, stationery, belated Christmas tomfoolery, and so forth, an array of masks and noses, and I realized that problem was solved. In a flash I saw my course. I turned about, no longer aimless, and went, circuitously in order to avoid the busy ways, toward the back streets north of the Strand, for I remembered, though not very distinctly where, that some theatrical costumers had shops in that district. The day was cold, with a biting wind down the northward running streets. I walked fast to avoid being overtaken, and every crossing was a danger, every passenger a thing to watch alertly. One man, as I was about to pass him at the top of Bedford Street, turned upon me abruptly and came into me, sending me into the road and almost under the wheel of a passing hansom. The verdict of the cab rank was that he had had some sort of stroke. I was so unnerved by this encounter that I went into Covent Garden Market, and sat down for some time in a quiet corner by a stall of violets, panting and trembling. I found I had caught a fresh cold, and had to turn out after a time, lest my sneezes attract attention. At last I reached the object of my quest, a dirty, fly-blown little shop, in a byway near Drury Lane, with a window full of tinsel robes, sham jewels, wigs, slippers, dominoes, and theatrical photographs. The shop was so old-fashioned and dark and low, the house rose above it for 4 stories. It was just simply dank and dismal. I peered through the window, and seeing no one within, entered. The opening of the door set a clanking bell ringing, and I left it open, and walked round a bare costume stand, into a corner behind a cheval-glass. For a minute or so no one came, and then I heard heavy feet striding across a room, and a man appeared down the shop. My plans were now perfectly definite. I proposed to make my way into the house, secrete myself upstairs, watch my opportunity, and, when everything was quiet, rummage out a wig, mask, spectacles, and costume, and go into the world, perhaps a grotesque, but still a credible figure. And incidentally, of course, I could rob the house of any available money. The man who had just entered the shop was a short, slight, hunched, beetle-browed man with long arms and very short, bandy legs. Apparently I had interrupted a meal. He stared about the shop with an expression of expectation. This gave way to surprise, then to anger as he saw the shop empty. "Those boys," he said. He went to stare up and down the street and came in again in a minute, kicked the door with his foot spitefully, and went muttering back to his house door. I came forward to follow him, and at the noise of my movement he stopped dead. I did so too, startled by his quickness of ear, and he slammed the house door in my face. I stood, hesitating, and suddenly I heard his quick footsteps returning, and the door reopened. He stood looking about the shop like one who was still not satisfied, and then murmuring to himself he examined the back of the counter and peered behind some fixtures, and then stood, doubtful. He left the house door open, and I slipped into the inner room. It was a strange little room, poorly furnished, and with a number of big masks in the corner. On the table was his belated breakfast, and a confoundedly exasperating thing for me, Kemp, to have to sniff his coffee and stand watching while he came in and resumed his meal. And his table manners were irritating. 3 doors opened to the little room, one going upstairs and one down, but they were all shut. I couldn't get out of the room while he was there. I could scarcely move because of his alertness, and there was a draught down my back. Twice I strangled a sneeze just in time. The spectacular quality of all my sensations was curious and novel, but for all that I was heartily tired and angry long before he had done his eating. But at last he made an end, and putting his beggarly crockery on the black tin tray upon which he had his teapot, and gathering all his crumbs up on the mustard-stained cloth, he took the lot of things after him. His burden prevented shutting the door behind him, as he would have done. I never saw such a man for shutting doors, and I followed him into a very dirty underground kitchen and scullery. I had the pleasure of seeing him begin to wash up, and then, finding no good in my keeping down there, and the brick floor being cold on my feet, I returned upstairs and sat in his chair by the fire. It was burning low, and I was scarcely thinking, when I put on a little coal. The noise of this brought him up at once, and he stood aglare. He peered about the room and was within an ace of touching me. Even after that examination, he scarcely seemed satisfied. He stopped in the doorway and took a final inspection before he went down. I waited in the little parlor for an age, and soon enough he came up and opened the upstairs door. I just managed to get by him. On the staircase he stopped suddenly, so that I very nearly blundered into him. He stood looking back straight into my face and listening. "I could have sworn," he said, and his long, hairy hand pulled at his lower lip. Then his eye went up and down the staircase, and he grunted and went up on again. His hand was on the middle of a door, and then he stopped again with the same puzzled anger on his face. He was becoming aware of the faint sounds of my movements about him. The man must have had diabolically acute hearing. He suddenly flashed into rage. "If there's anyone in this house," he cried with an oath, and left the thread unfinished. He put his hand in his pocket, failed to find what he wanted, and he rushed past me, blundering noisily and pugnaciously downstairs. But I didn't follow him. I sat on the head of the staircase until his return. Presently he came up again, still muttering, and opened the door of my room, and, before I could enter, slammed it in my face. Oh. I resolved to explore the house, and spent some time in doing so as noiselessly as possible. The house was very old and tumble-down, damp so that the paper in the attics was peeling from the walls, and rat-infested. 'Infested. 'Some of the door handles were stiff, and I was afraid to turn them. 'The door handles were stiff, and I was afraid to turn them. 'The door handles were stiff, and I was afraid to turn them. 'The door handles were stiff, and I was afraid to turn them. 'The door handles were stiff, and I was afraid to turn them. 'The door handles were stiff, and I was afraid to turn them. 'The door handles were stiff, and I was afraid to turn them. 'The door handles were stiff, and I was afraid to turn them. 'The door handles were stiff, and I was afraid to turn them. 'The door handles were stiff, and I was afraid to turn them. 'The door handles were stiff, and I was afraid to turn them. 'The door handles were stiff, and I was afraid to turn them. 'The door handles were stiff, and I was afraid to turn them. 'The door handles were stiff, and I was afraid to turn them. 'The door handles were stiff, and I was afraid to turn them. 'The door handles were stiff, and I was afraid to turn them. 'The door handles were stiff, and I was af Love when I drop things. It's my favorite. Several rooms I did inspect were unfurnished, and others were littered with theatrical lumber, bought second-hand, I judged from its appearance. Excuse me. In one room next to his, I found a lot of old clothes. I began routing among these, and in my eagerness forgot again the evident sharpness of his ears. I heard a stealthy footstep, and looking up just in time, saw him peering in at the tumbled heap and holding an old-fashioned revolver in his hand. I stood perfectly still while he stared about open-mouthed and suspicious. It must have been her. It must have been. He shut the door quietly, and immediately I heard the key turn in the lock. Then his footsteps retreated. I realized abruptly that I was locked in. For a minute I didn't know what to do. I walked from the door to the window and back. And stood perplexed. A gust of anger came upon me, but I decided to inspect the clothes before I did anything further, and my first attempt caught down a pile from an upper shelf. This brought him back, more sinister than ever, and that time he actually touched me and jumped back with amazement, and stood astonished in the middle of the room. And then he calmed down a little. "Rat," he said in an undertone, fingers on his lips. He was evidently a little scared, and so I edged quietly out of the room, but a plank creaked. Then the infernal little brute started going all over the house, revolver in hand, and locking door after door and pocketing the keys. When he realized what he was up to, I had a fit of rage. I could hardly control myself sufficiently to watch my opportunity. By this time I knew he was alone in the house, and so I made no more ado, and I knocked him on the head. "You knocked him on the head?" exclaimed Kemp. "Yes, stunned him as he was going downstairs. Hit him from behind with a stool that stood on the landing. He went downstairs like a bag of old boots." "But I say, the common conventions of humanity—" "Are all very well for common people, but the point was, Kemp, I had to get out of the house in a disguise without his seeing me. I couldn't think of any other way of doing it. And I gagged him with a Louis Quatorze vest and tied him up in a sheet." "Tied him up in a sheet?" "Made a sort of bag of it. It was a rather good idea to keep the idiot scared and quiet, and a devilish hard thing to get out of. Head away from the string, anyway." "My dear Kemp, it's no good your sitting glaring as though I was a murderer. It had to be done. He had his revolver. If he saw me once, he'd be able to describe me." "But still, in England, today, and the man was in his own house, and you were, well, robbing." "Robbing? Confound it, you'll call me a thief next. Surely, Kemp, you're not fool enough to dance on the old strings. Can't you see my position?" "And his, too." "What do you mean to say?" Kemp's face grew a trifle hard at this. He was about to speak, and then he checked himself. "I suppose, after all," he said, with a sudden change of manner, "the thing had to be done. You were in a fix, but still—" "Of course I was in a fix, an infernal fix. And he made me wild, too, hunting about the house, fooling about with his revolver, locking and unlocking doors. He was simply exasperating. You don't blame me, do you?" "You don't blame me?" "I never blame anyone. It's quite out of fashion. What'd you do next?" "Well, I was hungry. Downstairs I found a loaf and some rank cheese, more than sufficient to satisfy my hunger. I took some brandy and some water, and then went up past my impromptu bag— he was still lying quite still— to the room containing the old clothes. This looked out upon the street, 2 lace curtains brown with dirt guarding the window. I went and peered out through their interstices, and outside the day was bright, by contrast with the brown shadows of the dismal house in which I found myself, dazzlingly bright. A brisk traffic was going by, fruit carts, a handsome 4-wheeler with a pile of boxes, a fishmonger's cart. I turned with spots of color swimming before my eyes in the shadowy fixtures before me. My excitement was giving place to a clear apprehension of my position again. The room was full of a faint scent of benzoline, used, I supposed, in cleaning the dark in the garments. I began a systematic search of the place. I should judge the hunchback had been alone in the house for some time, for he was a curious person. Everything that could possibly be of service to me when I collected, in the closed storeroom, and then I made a deliberate selection. I found a handbag I thought a suitable possession, and some powder, rouge, and sticking plaster. I had thought of painting and powdering my face, and all that there was to show of me, in order to render myself visible, but the disadvantage of this lay in the fact that I should require turpentine and other appliances in a considerable amount of time before I could vanish again. Finally, I chose a mask of the better type, slightly grotesque, but not more so than many human beings. Dark glasses, grayish whiskers, and a wig. I could find no underclothing, but that I could buy subsequently, and for some time I swathed myself in calico dominoes and some white cashmere scarfs. I could find no socks, but the hunchback's boots were a rather loose fit, sufficed. In the desk in the shop there were 3 sovereigns and about 30 shillings worth of silver, and in a locked cabinet I burst into on the inner floor there was 8 pounds of gold. I could go forth into the world again, equipped. And then came a curious hesitation. Was my appearance really credible? I tried myself with my little bedroom looking-glass, inspecting myself from every point of view to discover any forgotten chunk, but it all seemed sound. It was grotesque in a theatrical pitch, a stage miser, but I certainly wasn't a physical improbability. Gathering confidence, I took my looking-glass down into the shop, pulled down the shop blinds, and surveyed myself from every point of view with the help of one of the cheval-glass in the corner. I spent some minutes screwing up my courage, and then unlocked the little shop door and marched out into the street, leaving the little man to get out of his sheet again when he liked. In 5 minutes a dozen turnings intervened between me and the customer's shop. No one appeared to be noticing me very pointedly. My last difficulty had been overcome. And at this, the invisible man stopped again. "And you troubled no more about the hunchback?" said Kemp. "No, neither have I heard what become of him. I suppose he untied himself or kicked himself out. The knots were pretty tight." He became silent and went to the window and stared out. "What happened when you went out into the Strand?" "Oh, disillusionment again. I thought my impulses were over. Practically, I thought I had impunity to do whatever I chose. Everything, save to give away my secret." "Are you troubled no more about the hunchback?" "No, and neither have I heard what became of him. I suppose he untied himself or kicked himself out," said the invisible man. "The knots were pretty tight, after all." At this he became silent and went to the window and stared out. "What happened when you went out into the Strand?" "Oh, disillusionment again. I thought my troubles were over. Practically, I thought I had impunity to do whatever I chose. Everything, save to give away my secret, of course. So I thought, well, whatever I did, whatever the consequences might be, were nothing to me. I had merely to fling aside my garments and vanish. No person could hold me. I could take my money where I found it. I decided to treat myself to a sumptuous feast, and then put up at a good hotel and accumulate a new outfit of property. I felt amazingly confident. It's not particularly pleasant recalling that I was, well, a bit of a rear end. I went into a place and was already ordering lunch, when it occurred to me I couldn't eat unless I exposed my invisible face. I finished ordering the lunch, told the man I should be back in 10 minutes, and went out exasperated. I don't know if you've ever been disappointed in your appetite. Not quite so badly, but I can imagine it. I could have smashed the silly devils. At last, faint with desire for tasteful food, I went into another place and demanded a private room. I'm disfigured, I said, badly. They looked at me curiously, but of course it wasn't their affair, and so at last I got my lunch. It wasn't particularly well served, but it sufficed. Oh, that's somebody going by. We're good. Sorry, I heard something go by on the gravel road. Anyway, it wasn't particularly well served, but it sufficed. And when I had had it, I sat over a cigar, trying to plan my line of action. And outside, a snowstorm was beginning. The more I thought it over, Kemp, the more I realized what a helpless absurdity an invisible man was, in a cold and dirty climate in a crowded, civilized city. Before I made this mad experiment, I had dreamt of 1,000 advantages, and that afternoon it seemed all disappointment. I went over the heads of things a man reckons desirable. No doubt invisibility made it possible to get them, but it made it impossible to enjoy them when you had them. Ambition, what's the good of pride of place when you can't appear there? What is the good of a love of, well, another when their name needs be Delilah? I have no taste for politics, for the blackguardisms of fame, for philanthropy, there we go, for sport. What was I to do? For this I'd become a wrapped-up mystery, a swathed and bandaged caricature of man. I'm reading. I know, but I'm reading. He paused, and his attitude suggested a roving glance at the window. How did you get to Iping? Said Kemp, anxious to keep his guest busy talking. I went there to work. I had one hope. It was half of an idea, and I still have it, if I'm honest. It's a full-blown idea now, a way of getting back, of restoring what I've done, when I choose, when I've done all I mean to do invisibly, and that is what I chiefly want to talk to you about now. You went straight to Iping? Yes. I had simply to get my 3 volumes of memoranda and my checkbook, my luggage and underclothing, order a quantity of chemicals to work out this idea of mine. I'll show you the calculations as soon as I get my books. And then I started. By Jove, I remember the snowstorm now, and the accursed bother it was to keep the snow from damping my pasteboard nose. At the end, the day before yesterday, when they found you out, you rather, to judge by the papers, said Kemp. I did, rather. Did I kill that fool of a constable? No, he expected to recover. Well, that's his luck, then. I clean lost my temper, the fools. Why couldn't they leave me alone, and that grocer, too? There are no deaths expected. I don't know about that tramp of mine, said the invisible man with an unpleasant laugh. By heaven, Kemp, you don't know what rage is. To have worked for years, to have planned and plotted, and then to get some fumbling, purblind idiot messing across your course. Every conceivable sort of silly creature that has ever been created has been sent across me. If I have much more of it, I'll go wild. I'll start mowing him. As it is, they've made things 1,000 times more difficult. No doubt it's exasperating, said Kemp dryly. What it does right now. Anyway. Chapter 14. The Plan That Failed. But now what are we to do? He moved nearer his guest as he spoke, in such a manner as to prevent the possibility of a sudden glimpse of the 3 men who were advancing up the hill road with an intolerable slowness, it seemed to Kemp anyway. What were you planning to do when you were heading for Port Burdock? Had you any plan? I was going to clear out of the country, but I've altered that plan rather since seeing you. I thought it would be wise, now the weather's hot and invisibility possible, to make for the south. Especially as my secret was known and everyone would be on the lookout for a masked and muffled man. You have a line of steamers from here to France. My idea was to get aboard one and run the risks of the passage. Thence I could go by train into Spain or else get to Algiers. It wouldn't be difficult. There a man might always be invisible and yet live. And do things. I was using that tramp as a money box and luggage carrier till I decided how to get my books and things sent over to meet me. That's clear. And then the filthy brute must needs try and rob me. He has hidden my books, Kemp. Hidden my books. If I can lay my hands on him. Best plan to get the books out of him first. Where is he? Do you know? He's in the town police station, locked up by his own request in the strongest cell in the place. But that hangs your plans a little. We must get those books. Those books are vital. Certainly, said Kemp, a little nervously, wondering if he heard footsteps outside. Certainly we must get these books. But that won't be difficult if he doesn't know they're for you. No, said the invisible man, and clearly fell into thought. Kemp tried to think of something to keep the talk going, but the invisible man resumed of his own accord. Blundering into your house, Kemp, changes all my plans, for you're a man that can understand. In spite of all that's happened, in spite of this publicity or the loss of my books, of what I've suffered, there still remain great possibilities, huge possibilities. You've told no one I'm here, yes? Kemp hesitated. That was implied. No one? Hesitated Griffin. Not a soul. No. The invisible man stood up and, sticking his arms akimbo, began to pace the study. I made a mistake, Kemp. A huge mistake. In carrying this thing through alone. I've wasted strength, time, opportunities. Alone, it's highly bless me. Sorry about that. I was interrupted. And I paused the recording. I made a mistake, Kemp. A huge mistake in carrying this through alone. I've wasted strength, time, opportunities. Alone, it's wonderful how little a man can do alone, to rob a little, to hurt a little. And there is the end. What I want, Kemp, is a goalkeeper, a helper, and a hiding place. An arrangement whereby I can sleep and eat and rest in peace, and unsuspected. I must have a confederate. With a confederate with food and rest, 1,000 things are possible. Hitherto I've gone on vague lines. We have to consider all that invisibility means, all that it doesn't mean. It means little advantage for eavesdropping and so forth. One makes sounds. It's of little help. A little help, perhaps, in housebreaking and so forth. Once you've caught me, you could easily imprison me, but on the other hand, I'm hard to catch. This invisibility, in fact, is really only good in 2 cases. It's useful in getting away, it's useful in approaching. It's particularly useful, therefore, in, well, killing. I can walk around a man, whatever weapon he has, choose my point, strike as I like, dodge as I like, escape as I like. Kemp's hand went to his mustache. Was that a movement downstairs? You see, Kemp, it's killing that we must do. It's killing we must do, you think? I'm listening to your plan, Griffin, but I'm not agreeing, mind you. Why? Why killing? Not wanton killing, you see. Now, that's barbaric, but a judicious slaying. The point is, they know there is an invisible man, as well as we know there is an invisible man. And that invisible man, Kemp, must now establish a reign of terror. Yes, no doubt, it's startling, I understand, but I mean it. A reign of terror. He must take some town like your Burdock and terrify and dominate it. He must issue his orders. He can do that in 1,000 ways. Scraps of paper thrust under doors would suffice. And all who would disobey these orders, he would strike down, and strike down anyone who would defend them. Said Kemp, no longer listening to Griffin, but to the sound of his front door opening and closing. It seems to me, Griffin, he said to cover his wandering attention, that your Confederate would be in a, well, rather difficult position. No one would know he was a Confederate, said the Invisible Man eagerly. And then suddenly, hush. What's that downstairs? Nothing, said Kemp, and suddenly began to speak, loudly and quickly. I don't agree to this, Griffin. Understand me, I don't agree to this. Why hope of playing a dream against the race? How can you help to gain happiness? Don't be a lone wolf. Publish your results, take the world, take the nation at least into your confidence. Think what you do might do with a million helpers. The Invisible Man interrupted him with an arm extended. There are footsteps coming upstairs, he said in a low voice. Nonsense. Let me see, said the Invisible Man, and he advanced, arm extended, to the door. And then a few things happened, very swiftly. Kemp hesitated for a second, and then moved to intercept him. The Invisible Man started and stood still. Traitor, cried the voice, and suddenly the dressing gown opened, and, sitting down, the unseen began to disrobe. Kemp made 3 swift steps to the door, and forthwith the Invisible Man, his legs had vanished, sprang to his feet with a shout. Kemp flung the door open, and as it opened, there came a sound of hurrying feet downstairs, and voices. With a quick movement, Kemp thrust the Invisible Man back, sprang aside, and slammed the door. The key was outside and ready. In another moment, Griffin would have been alone in the Belvedere study, a prisoner, save for one little thing. The key had been slipped in hastily that morning. As Kemp slammed the door, it fell, noisily, upon the carpet. Kemp's face became white, and he tried to grip the door handle with both hands. For a moment he stood, lugging, and then the door gave, 6 inches, but he got it closed again. The second time it was jerked a foot wide, and the dressing gown came wedging itself into the opening. His throat was gripped by invisible fingers, and he left his hold on the handle to defend himself. He was forced back, tripped, and pitched heavily into the corner of the landing. The empty dressing gown was flung on top of him. Halfway up the staircase was Colonel Ide, the recipient of Kemp's letter, the chief of the Burdock police. He was staring aghast at the sudden appearance of Kemp, followed by the extraordinary sight of clothing tossing empty in the air. He saw Kemp felled and struggling to his feet, and he saw him rush forward and go down again, felled like an ox. And then suddenly he was struck violently by nothing. A vast weight, it seemed, leapt upon him, and he was hurtled headlong down the staircase with a grip on his throat and a knee in his stomach. An invisible foot trod on his back, a ghostly patter passed downstairs, and he heard the 2 police officers in the hall shout and run, and the front door of the house slammed violently. He rolled over and sat up staring, and he saw, staggering down the staircase, Kemp, dusty and disheveled, one side of his face white from a blow, his lip bleeding, and a pink dressing gown and some underclothing held in his arms. My goodness, the game's up, he's gone! Chapter 25. The Hunting of the Invisible Man. For a space, Kemp was too inarticulate to make Ade understand the swift things that had just happened. They stood on the landing, Kemp speaking swiftly, the grotesque swathings of Griffin still on his arm. But presently Ade began to grasp something of the situation. He's mad, inhuman, he's pure selfishness. Thinks of nothing but his own advantage, his own safety. I've listened to such a story this morning of brutal self-seeking. He's wounded men. He'll kill them unless we can prevent him. He'll create a panic. Nothing can stop him. He's going out now, furious.
Well, he must be caught, that's it.
But how? Cried Kemp, and suddenly became full of ideas. You must begin at once. You must set every available man to work. You have to prevent his leaving this district. Once he gets away, he will go through the countryside as he wills, killing and maiming. He dreams a reign of terror. I mean it. You must set a watch on trains and roads and shipping. The garrison has to help. You wire for help. The only thing that'll keep him here is the thought of recovering some books of notes he counts as value. I can tell you that. There's a man in your police station, Marvel.
I know, Those bucks, yes, but the tramp...
Says he hasn't them, but he thinks the tramp has them. And you must prevent him from eating or sleeping. Day and night the country must be astir for him. Food must be locked up and secured, all food, so that I have to break his way to it. Houses everywhere have to be barred against him. Heaven sent us cold nights and rain. The whole countryside must begin hunting and keep hunting. I tell you, Aid, he's a danger, a disaster, unless he's pinned and secured. It's frightful to think of the things that may happen.
What else can we do? I must go down at once and begin organizing. But why not come with me? Yes, you come too. Come. We must hold a sort of council of war. Get Hobbs to help us. And the railway masters. By Jove, it's urgent. Come along, tell me as we go. What else is there we can do? Put that stuff down.
In another moment, Aid was leading the way downstairs. They found the front door open and the policeman standing outside, staring at empty air. He's gone away, sir.
We must go down to the central station at once. One of you go on down and get a cab to come up and meet us, quickly. Camp, what else?
Dogs. Get dogs. They don't see him, but they wind him. Get dogs.
Good, it's not generally known, but the prison officials over at Housestead know a man with bloodhounds. Dogs, what else?
Bear in mind his food shows. After eating, his food shows until it's assimilated, so he has to hide after eating. You have to keep after him, every thicket, every quiet corner. Put all weapons, any implements that might be weapons away. He can't carry such things for long, and what he can snatch up and strike men with must be hidden away.
Do it again. We'll have him yet.
And on the roads...
Yes?
Powdered glass. It's cruel, I know, but think of what he may do. Aid drew the air in sharply between his teeth.
It's unsportsmanlike. I don't know. But I'll have powdered glass got ready if he goes too far.
The man's inhuman, I tell you. I'm sure he'll establish a reign of terror. So soon as he got over the emotions of this escape, I'm sure, as I'm sure I'm talking to you, our only chance is to get ahead of him if he's cut himself off from, well, humankind. His blood be upon his own head. Chapter 26. The Wicksteed Murder. The Invisible Man seems to have rushed out of Kemp's house in a state of blind fury. A little child playing near Kemp's gateway was violently caught up and thrown aside so that its ankle was broken, and thereafter for some hours the Invisible Man passed out of human perceptions. No one knows where he went nor what he did, but one can imagine him hurrying through the hot June forenoon, up on the hill and onto the open downland behind Port Burdock, raging and despairing at his intolerable fate, and sheltering at last, heated and weary, under the thickets of Hintondine, to piece together again his shattered schemes against his species. That seems the most probable refuge for him, for there it was he reasserted himself in a grimly tragic manner about 2 in the afternoon. One wonders what his state of mind may have been during that time, and what plans he devised. No doubt he was almost ecstatically exasperated by Kemp's treachery, and though we may be able to understand the motives that led to the deceit, we may still imagine and even sympathize a little with the fury the attempted surprise must have astonished. Perhaps something of the stunned astonishment of his Oxford Street experiences may have returned to him, for he had evidently counted on Kemp's cooperation in his brutal dream of a terrorized world. At any rate, he vanished from human ken about midday, and no living witness can tell what he did until about 2:30. It was a fortunate thing, perhaps, for humanity, but for him it was a fatal inaction. During that time, a growing multitude of men scattered over the countryside were busy. In the morning he'd still been simply a legend, a terror. In the afternoon, by virtue chiefly of Kemp's dryly worded proclamation, he was presented as a tangible antagonist, to be wounded, captured, or overcome, and the countryside began organizing itself with inconceivable rapidity. By 2 o'clock even, he might still have removed himself out of the district by getting aboard a train, but after 2 that became impossible. Every passenger train along the lines had a great parallelogram between Southampton, Manchester, Brighton, and Horsham travelled with locked doors, and the goods traffic was almost entirely suspended. And in a great circle of 20 miles round Port Burdock, men armed with guns and bludgeoned were presently sitting out in groups of 3 or 4 with dogs to beat the roads and fields. Mounted policemen rode along the country lanes, stopping at every cottage and warning the people to lock up their houses and keep indoors unless they were armed. And all the elementary schools had broken up by 3 o'clock, and the children, scared and keeping together in groups, were hurrying home. Kemp's proclamation, signed indeed by aid, was posted over the whole district by 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon. It gave briefly but clearly all the conditions of the struggle: the necessity of keeping the Invisible Man from food and sleep, the necessity for incessant watchfulness and a prompt attention to any evidence of his movements. And so swift and decided was the action of the authorities, so prompt and universal was the belief in this strange being, that before nightfall an area of several hundred square miles was in a stringent state of siege. And before nightfall, too, a thrill of horror went through the whole watching, nervous countryside. Going from whispering mouth to mouth, swift and certain over the length and breadth of the country, passed the story of the murder of Mr. Wicksteed. If our supposition that the Invisible Man's refuge was the Hintondonian thickets, then we must suppose that in the early afternoon he sallied out again, bent upon some project that involved the use of a weapon. We cannot know what the project was, but the evidence was that he had an iron rod in hand before he met Wicksteed, to me, and that was at least overwhelming. Of course, we can know nothing of the details of the encounter. It occurred on the edge of a gravel pit, not 200 yards from Lord Burdock's lodge gate. Everything points to a desperate struggle: the trampled ground, the numerous wounds Mr. Wicksteed received his splintered walking stick. But why the attack was made, save in a murderous frenzy, it's almost impossible to imagine. Indeed, the theory of madness is almost unavoidable. Mr. Wicksteed was a man of 45 or 46, steward to Lord Burdock, of inoffensive habits and appearance, and the very last person in the world to provide such a terrible antagonist. Against him, it would seem, the Invisible Man used an iron rod dragged from a broken piece of fence. He stopped this quiet man, going quietly home to his midday meal, attacked him, beat down his feeble defenses, broke his arm, felled him, and smashed his head to nothing more than jelly. Of course, he must have dragged this rod out of the fencing before he met his victim. He must have been carrying it ready in his hand. Only 2 details, beyond what has already been stated, seem to bear on the matter. One is the circumstance that the gravel pit was not in Mr. Wicksteed's direct path home, but nearly a couple hundred yards out of his way. The other is the assertion of a young girl to the effect that, going to her afternoon school, she saw the murdered man trotting in a peculiar manner across a field toward the gravel pit. Her pantomime of his action suggests a man pursuing something on the ground before him and striking at it ever and again with his walking stick. She was the last person to see him alive. He passed out of her sight to his death, the struggle being hidden from her only by a clump of beech trees and a slight depression in the ground. Now this, to the present writer's mind at least, lifts the murder out of the realm of the absolutely wanton. We may imagine that Griffin had taken the rod as a weapon indeed, but without any deliberate intention of using it in murder. Wicksteed may then have come by and noticed this rod inexplicably moving through the air, and without any thought of the Invisible Man, for Port Burdock is 10 miles away, he may have pursued it. It's quite conceivable he may not have even heard of the Invisible Man. One can then imagine the Invisible Man making off quietly, in order to avoid discovering his presence in the neighborhood, and Wicksteed, excited and curious, pursuing this unaccountably locomotive object, finally striking at it. No doubt the Invisible Man could have easily distanced his middle-aged pursuer under ordinary circumstances, but the position in which Wicksteed's body was found suggests he had the ill luck to drive his quarry into a corner between a drift of stinging nettles and the gravel pit. To those who To those who appreciate the extraordinary irascibility of the Invisible Man, the rest of the encounter will be easy to imagine. But this is, of course, pure hypothesis. The only undeniable facts, for stories of children are often unreliable, are the discovery of Wicksteed's body, done to death, and the blood-stained iron rod flung among the nettles. The abandonment of the rod by Griffin suggests in the emotional attachment of the fare, the purpose for which he took it, if he had a purpose, was abandoned. He was certainly an intensely egotistical and unfeeling man, but the sight of his first victim, bloody and pitiful at his feet, may have released some long-pent fountain of remorse, which for a time may have flooded whatever scheme of action he had contrived. After the murder of Mr. Wicksteed, he would seem to have struck across the country, toward the downland. There's a story of a voice heard about sunset by a couple of men in a field near Fernbottom. It was wailing and laughing, sobbing, groaning, and ever and again it shouted. It must have been strange to hear. It drove up across the middle of a clover field and died away toward the hills. That afternoon, the Invisible Man must have learnt something of the rapid use Kemp had made of his confidences. He must have found houses locked and secured. He may have loitered about railway stations and prowled about inns, and no doubt he read the proclamations and realized something of the nature of the campaign against him. And as the evening advanced, the fields became dotted, here and there, with groups of 3 or 4 men, noisy with the yelping of dogs. These men-hunters had particular instructions in the case of an encounter as to the way they should support one another. But he avoided them all. We may understand something of his exasperation, and it could have been none the less because he himself had supplied the information that was being used so remorselessly against him. For that day, at least, he lost heart. For nearly 24 hours, save when he turned on Wicksteed, he was a hunted man. In the night he must have eaten and slept, for in the morning he was himself again, active, powerful, angry and malignant, prepared for his last great struggle against the world. It's time to take a short break, and I would invite you to, if you're listening to the recording, pause the video. If you're live on stream, just, I guess, pause the stream and come back. That's also a thing that you can do. I'd invite you to take this time to, go get a glass of water, maybe some snacks. Get up and stretch your legs if you've been sitting around. It's not the best thing to be sitting for too long. Did everybody have a good snack, good water, good stretch break? I sure did. See, the good thing about the recording is I pause the recording while I'm getting a stretch. I'm having myself a stretch break. So you all, that time passes real quick for you since you can just pause the recording. Anyway, let's jump right back into it with chapter 27, The Siege of Kemp's House. Kemp read a strange missive written in pencil on a greasy sheet of paper. "You've been amazingly energetic and clever," this letter ran, "though what you stand to gain by it... Stand to gain? No, that's wrong. It's though what you stand to gain by it I cannot imagine. You're against me. For a whole day you've chased me. You've tried to rob me of a night's rest. But I've had food in spite of you. I've slept in spite of you, and the game's only beginning. The game is only beginning. There's nothing for it but to start the terror. This announces the first day of the terror. Port Burdock is no longer under the Queen. Tell your colonel of police and the rest of them. It's me, the terror. This is day 1 of year 1 of the new epoch, the epoch of the Invisible Man. I am Invisible Man the first. To begin with, the rule will be easy. The first day there will be 1 execution. For the sake of example, a man named Kemp. Death starts for him today. He may lock himself away, hide himself away, get guards about him, put on armor, if he likes. Death, the unseen death, is coming. Let him take precautions, it'll impress my people. Death starts from the pillar box by midday. The letter will fall in as the postman comes along, then off. The game begins. Death starts. Help him not, my people, lest death fall upon you also. Today Kemp is to die. Kemp read this letter twice. "It's no hoax. That's his voice, and he means it." He turned the folded sheet over and saw on the addressed side of it the postmark Hintondean and the prosaic detail 2D to pay. He got up slowly, leaving his lunch unfinished. The letter had come by the 1 o'clock post, and went into his study. He rang for his housekeeper and told her to go round the house at once, examine all the fastenings of the windows, close all the shutters. He closed the shutters of his study himself, and from a locked drawer in his bedroom he took a little revolver, examined it carefully, and put it into the pocket of his lounge jacket. He wrote a number of brief notes, one to Colonel Ade, gave him to his servant to take, with explicit instructions as to her way of leaving the house. "There's no danger," he said, and added a mental reservation. "To you." He remained meditative for a space after doing this, and then returned to his cooling lunch. And he ate with gaps of thought. Finally he struck the table sharply. "We'll have him, and I'm the bait. He'll come too far." He went up to the Belvedere, carefully shutting every door after him. "It's a game, an odd game, but the chances are all for me, Mr. Griffin, in spite of your invisibility. Griffin contra mundum, with a vengeance." He stood at the door, staring at the hot hillside. "He must get food every day, and I don't envy him. Did he really sleep last night, out in the open somewhere, secure from collisions? I wish we could get some good cold, wet weather instead of the heat. He may be watching me now." He went close to the window, and something rapped smartly against the brickwork over the frame, and made him start violently back. "I'm getting nervous," said Kemp, but it was 5 minutes before he went to the window again. "It must have been a sparrow." Presently he heard the front doorbell ringing, and hurried downstairs. He unbolted and unlocked the door, examined the chain, put it up, and opened cautiously, without showing himself. A familiar voice hailed him, and it was Ade.
Your servant's been assaulted, Kemp."
"What?"
"Heard that note of yours taken away from her. He's close about here. Let me in."
Kemp released the chain, and Ade entered through as narrow an opening as possible. He stood in the hall, looking with infinite relief at Kemp refastening the door.
"Note was fastened out, but note was snatched out of her hand, scared her horribly. Was down at the station. She's in hysterics. She's close around here. What's it about?"
Kemp swore. "What a fool I was. I might have known. It's not an hour's walk from Hintondean already."
"What's up?"
"Look here," said Kemp, and led the way into his study. He handed Ade the invisible man's letter. Ade read it and whistled softly.
"Have you?"
"Proposed a trap, like a fool, and sent my proposal out by a maidservant. To him." Ade followed Kemp's profanity.
"You clear out."
"Not him." A resounding smash of glass came from upstairs, and Ade had a silvery glimpse of a little revolver half out of Kemp's pocket. "It's a window upstairs," said Kemp, and led the way up. There came a second smash while they were still on the staircase, and when they reached the study they found 2 of the 3 windows smashed, half the room littered with splintered glass, and one big flint lying on the writing table. The 2 men stopped in the doorway, contemplating the wreckage, and Kemp swore again, and as he did so the 3rd window went with a snap like a pistol, hung starred for a moment, and then collapsed in jagged, shivering triangles into the room.
"What's this for?"
"It's a beginning."
"There's no way of climbing up here?"
"Not for a cat."
"No shutters?"
"Not here. All the downstairs rooms. Hello!" A smash, and then a whack of boards hit hard came from downstairs. "Confound him, that must be... Yes, it's one of the bedrooms. He's going to do all the house, but he's a fool. The shutters are up and the glass will fall outside. He'll cut his feet." Another window proclaimed its destruction, and the 2 men stood on the landing, perplexed. "I have it." Or rather,
"I have it,"
said Ade.
"Let me get a stick or something. I'll go down to the station, get the bloodhounds put on. That ought to settle him. They're hard by, not 10 minutes.
Another window went the way of its fellows.
"You haven't a revolver?"
Kemp's hand went to his pocket, and then he hesitated. I haven't one, at least to spare.
I'll bring it back. It'll be safe here.
Kemp, ashamed of his momentary lapse from truthfulness, handed him the weapon.
Now for the door.
As they stood hesitating in the hall, they heard one of the first-floor bedroom windows crack and clash. Kemp went to the door and began to slip the bolts as silently as possible, and his face was a little paler than usual. You must keep straight out, said Kemp, and in another moment Aid was on the doorstep, and the bolts were dropping back into the staples. He hesitated for a moment, feeling more comfortable with his back against the door, and then he marched upright and square down the steps. He crossed the lawn and approached the gate. A little breeze seemed to ripple over the grass. Something moved near him.
Stop a bit,
said a voice, and Aid stopped dead, and his hand tightened on the revolver.
Well?
Said Aid, white and grim, every nerve tense. Oblige me by going back to the house, said the voice, as tense and grim as Aid's.
Sorry,
said Aid a little hoarsely, and moistened his lips with his tongue. The voice was on his left front, he thought. Suppose he was to take his luck with a shot. What are you going for? Said the voice, and there was a quick movement of the two, and a flash of sunlight from the open lip of Aid's pocket. Aid desisted and thought.
Where I go,
he said slowly,
is my own business.
The words were still on his lips when an arm came round his neck, his back felt a knee, and he was sprawling backward. He drew clumsily and fired absurdly, and in another moment he was struck in the mouth, and the revolver wrested from his grip. He made a vain catch at a slippery limb, tried to struggle up, and fell back. The voice laughed. I'd kill you now if it wasn't the waste of a bullet, it said, and he saw the revolver in midair, 6 feet off, covering him.
Well?
Get up. And that this Aid stood up. Attention. Don't try any games. Remember, I can see your face if you can't see mine. You've got to go back to the house.
You won't let me in.
That's a pity. I've got no quarrel with you. Aid moistened his lips again, and he glanced away from the barrel of the revolver, and saw the sea far off, very blue and dark under the midday sun, the smooth green down, the white cliff of the head, and the multitudinous town, and suddenly he knew that life was very sweet. His eyes came back to this little metal thing hanging between heaven and earth, 6 yards away.
What am I to do?
What am I to do? You'll get help. The only thing is for you to get back. There.
I'll try. If he lets you in, will you promise not to rush the door?
I've got no quarrel with you. Kemp had hurried upstairs after letting Aid out, and now crouching among the broken glass and peering cautiously over the edge of the study windowsill, he saw Aid parleying with the unseen. Why doesn't he fire? Whispered Kemp to himself. Then the revolver moved a little, and the glint of the sunlight flashed in Kemp's eyes. He shaded his eyes and tried to see the source of the blinding beam. Surely Aid has given up the revolver.
Promise not to rush the door,
Aid was saying.
You don't push a winning game too far. Give a man a chance.
You go back to the house. I'll tell you flatly, I won't promise anything. Aid's decision seemed suddenly made. He turned toward the house, walking slowly with his hands behind him, and Kemp watched him, puzzled. The revolver vanished, flashed again into sight, vanished again, and became evident on a closer scrutiny as a little dark object following Aid. Then things happened very quickly. Aid leapt backward, swung around, clutched at the little object, missed it, and threw up his hands, and fell forward on his face, leaving a little puff of blue in the air. Kemp didn't hear the sound of the shot, and Aid writhed, raised himself on one arm, fell forward, and then lay still. For a space Kemp remained staring at the quiet carelessness of Aid's attitude. The afternoon was very hot and still. Nothing seemed stirring in all the world save a couple of yellow butterflies chasing each other through the shrubbery between the house and the road gate. Aid lay on the lawn near that gate, and the blinds and the blinds of all the villas down the hill road were drawn. But in one little green summer house was a white figure, apparently an old man asleep. Kemp scrutinized the surroundings of the house for a glimpse of the revolver, but it had vanished. His eyes came back to aid in the game he knew was opening well. Oh, excuse me. Then came a ringing and a knocking at the front door that grew at last tumultuous. But pursuant to Kemp's instructions, the servants had locked themselves into their rooms. This was followed by a silence. Kemp sat, listening, then began peering cautiously out of the 3 windows, one after another. He went to the staircase head and stood listening, uneasily. He armed himself with his bedroom poker, and went to examine the interior fastenings of the ground floor windows again. Everything was safe and quiet. He returned to the belvedere, where Aid lay motionless over the edge of the gravel, just as he had fallen. Coming along the road by the villas were the housemaid and 2 policemen. Everything was deathly still. The 3 people seemed very slow in approaching, and he wondered what this antagonist was doing. He started. There was a smash from below. He hesitated and went downstairs again. Suddenly the house resounded with heavy blows and the splintering of wood. He heard a smash and the destructive clang of the iron fastenings of the shutters. He turned the key and opened the kitchen door, and as he did so, the shutters, split and splintering, came flying inward. He stood aghast. The window frame, save for one crossbar, was still intact, but only little teeth of glass remained in the frame. The shutters had been driven in with an axe, and now the axe was descending and sweeping blows upon the window frame and the iron bars defending it. And then suddenly it leapt aside and vanished. He saw the revolver lying on the path outside, and then the little weapon sprang into the air. He dodged back, and the revolver cracked, just too late. And a splinter from the edge of the closing door flashed over his head. He slammed and locked the door, and as he stood outside, he heard Griffin shouting and laughing. Then the blows of the axe with its splitting and smashing consequences were resumed. Kemp stood in the passage, trying to think. In a moment the invisible man would be in the kitchen. This door wouldn't keep him a moment, and then a ringing came at the front door again. It would be the policeman. He ran into the hall, put up the chain, and drew the bolts. He made the girl speak before he dropped the chain, and the 3 people blundered into the house in a heap, and Kemp slammed the door again. The invisible man, he has a revolver with 2 shots left. He killed Aid, shot him anyhow. Didn't you see him on the lawn? He's lying there.
Who?
Aid. We came in the back way, said the girl.
What's that smashing?
Asked one of the policemen. He's in the kitchen, or will be. He's found an axe. And suddenly the house was full of the invisible man's resounding blows on the kitchen door. The girl stared towards the kitchen, shuddered, and retreated into the dining room. Kemp tried to explain in broken sentences, and they heard the kitchen door give. This way, said Kemp, starting into activity, and bundled the policeman into the dining room doorway. The poker, said Kemp, and rushed to the fender. He handed the poker he'd carried to the policeman in the dining room, one to the other. He suddenly flung himself backwards. Oh, said one policeman, ducked and caught the axe on his poker. The pistol snapped its penultimate shot and ripped a valuable Sidney Cooper. The second policeman brought his poker down on the little weapon as one might knock down a wasp and sent it rattling to the floor. At the first clash, the girl screamed, stood screaming for a moment by the fireplace, and then ran to open the shutters, possibly with an idea of escaping by the shattered window. The axe receded into the passage and fell to a position about 2 feet from the ground. They could hear the invisible man breathing. Stand away, you 2. I want that man, Kemp. And we want you, said the first policeman, making a quick step toward and wiping with the poker at the voice. The invisible man must have started back as he blundered into the umbrella stand. Then as the policeman staggered with the swing of the blow he'd aimed, the invisible man countered with the axe. The helmet crumpled like paper, and the blow sent the man spinning to the floor at the head of the kitchen stairs. But the second policeman, aiming behind the axe with his poker, hit something soft that snapped. There was a sharp exclamation of pain, and then the axe fell to the ground. The policeman wiped again at vacancy and hit nothing, but he put his foot on the axe and struck again. Then he stood, poker clubbed, listening intent for the slightest movement. He heard the dining room window open and a quick rush of feet within. His companion rolled over and sat up, with blood running down between his eye and ear.
"Where is he?" "I don't know. It hit him. He's standing somewhere in the hall, unless he slipped past you, Dr. Kemp, sir."
Paused, and he paused.
"Dr. Kemp?"
cried the policeman again. And the second policeman began struggling to his feet. He stood up, and they suddenly heard the pad of bare feet on the kitchen stairs.
"There he is!"
cried the first policeman, and incontinently flung his poker. It smashed a little gas bracket, and he made as if he would pursue the invisible man downstairs. Then he thought better of it and stepped into the dining room.
"Dr. Kemp,"
he began and stopped short.
"Dr. Kemp's a hero,"
he said as his companion looked over his shoulder. The dining room window was wide open, and neither housemaid nor Kemp was to be seen. The second policeman's opinion of Kemp was a little more terse and vivid, shall we say. Chapter 28. The Hunter Hunted. Mr. Heelis, Mr. Kemp's nearest neighbor among the villa holders, was asleep in his summer house when the siege of Kemp's house began. Mr. Heelis was one of the sturdy minority who refused to believe in all this nonsense about an invisible man. His wife, however, well, as he was subsequently to be reminded, she did. He insisted upon walking about his garden just as if nothing was the matter, and he went to sleep in the afternoon in accordance with the custom of years. He slept through the smashing of the windows and then woke up suddenly with a curious persuasion of something wrong. He looked across at Kemp's house, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. Then he put his feet to the ground and sat listening. He said he was damned, but the strange thing was visible. The house looked as though it had been deserted for weeks after a violent riot. Every window was broken, and every window save those of the Belvedere study were blinded by the internal shutters.
"I could have sworn it was all right."
And at this he looked at his watch.
20 minutes ago.
He became aware of a measured concussion and the clash of glass far away in the distance. And then as he sat, open-mouthed, came still a more wonderful thing. The shutters of the drawing-room window were flung open violently, and the housemaid in her outdoor hat and garments appeared struggling in a frantic manner to throw up the sash. Suddenly a man appeared beside her, helping her, Dr. Kemp. In another moment the window was open, and the housemaid was struggling out. She pitched forward and vanished among the shrubs. Mr. Heelis stood up, exclaiming vaguely and vehemently at all these wonderful things. He saw Kemp stand on the sill, spring from the window, and reappear almost instantaneously, running along a path in the shrubbery, and stooping as he ran, like a man who evades observation. He vanished behind a laburnum, and appeared again, clambering over a fence that abutted on the open down. In a second he had tumbled over, and was running at a tremendous pace down the slope toward Mr. Heelis.
"Good heavens!" cried Mr. Heelis, struck with an idea. "It's that invisible man brood. It's right after all."
With Mr. Heelis to think things like that was to act, and his cook, watching him from the top window, was amazed to see him come pelting toward the house at a good 9 miles an hour. There was a slamming of doors, a ringing of bells, and the voice of Mr. Heelis bellowing like a bull.
"Shut the doors! Shut the windows! Shut everything! The invisible man's coming!"
Instantly the house was full of screams and directions and scurrying feet. He ran himself to shut the French windows that opened on the veranda, and as he did so, Kemp's head and shoulders and knee appeared over the edge of the garden fence. In another moment Kemp had plowed through the asparagus and was running across the tennis lawn to the house.
"You can't come in," said Mr. Heelis, shutting the bolts. "I'm very sorry if he's after you, but you can't come in."
Kemp appeared with a face of terror close to the glass, rapping and then shaking frantically at the French window. If that last thing hadn't dropped off in the middle of that would have been really good Foley.
Then, seeing his efforts were useless, he ran along the veranda, vaulted the end, and went to hammer at the side door. Then he ran round by the side gate to the front of the house, and so into the hill road. And Mr. Heelas, staring from his window, a face of horror, had scarcely witnessed Kemp vanish ere the asparagus was being trampled this way and that by feet unseen. At that, Mr. Heelas fell precipitately upstairs, and the rest of the chase is beyond his purview. But as he passed the staircase window, he heard the side gate slam. Emerging into the hill road, Kemp naturally took the downward direction, and so it was he came to run in his own person the very race he had watched with such a critical eye from the Belvedere study only 4 days ago. He ran it well for a man out of training, and though his face was pale and wet, his wits were cool to the last. He ran with long, wide strides, and wherever a patch of rough ground intervened, wherever there came a patch of raw flints or a bit of broken glass shone dazzling, he crossed it, and left the bare invisible feet that followed to take what line they could. For the first time in his life, Kemp discovered that the hill road was indescribably vast and desolate, and that the beginnings of the town far below at the hill were strangely remote. Never had there been a slower or more painful method of progression than running. All the gaunt villas, sleeping in the afternoon sun, looked locked and barred. No doubt they were locked and barred by his own orders, actually. But at any rate, they might have kept a lookout for an eventuality like this. The town was rising up now, the sea had dropped out of sight behind it, and people down below were stirring. A tram was just arriving at the hill foot. Beyond that was the police station. Was that footsteps he heard behind him? He put on a burst of speed. The people below were staring at him. 1 or 2 were running, and his breath was beginning to saw in his throat. The tram was quite near now, and the jolly cricketers were noisily barring its doors. Beyond the tram were posts and heaps of gravel, the drainage works. He had a transitory idea of jumping into the tram and slamming the doors. Then he resolved to go for the police station. In another moment he had passed the door of the jolly cricketers and was in the blistering end of the street, with human beings about him. The tram driver and his helper, arrested by the sight of the furious haste, stood staring with the tram horses unhitched. Further on, the astonished features of navvies appeared above the mounds of gravel. His pace broke a little. Then he heard the swift pad of his pursuer and leapt forward again. "The invisible man!" he cried to the navvies, with a vague indicative gesture, and by inspiration leapt the excavation and placed a burly group between him and the chase. Then, abandoning the idea of the police station, he turned into a little side street, rushed by a greengrocer's cart, hesitated for the 10th of a second at the door of a sweetstuff shop, and then made for the mouth of an alley that ran back into the main hill street again. 2 or 3 little children were playing here, and shrieked and scattered at his apparition, and forthwith doors and windows opened, and excited mothers revealed their hearts. Out he shot into Hill Street again, 300 yards from the tram line end, and immediately he became aware of a tumultuous vociferation and running people. He glanced up the street toward the hill. Hardly a dozen yards off ran a huge navvy, cursing in fragments and slashing viciously with a spade, and hard behind him came the tram conductor with his fist clenched. Up the street, others followed these two, striking and shouting, and down towards the town men and women were running, and he noticed clearly one man coming out of a shop door with a stick in his hand. "Spread out! Spread out!" cried one. Kemp suddenly grasped the altered condition of the chase, and he stopped and looked round, panting. "He's close here. Form a line across," and then he was hit hard under the ear, and went reeling, trying to face round toward his unseen antagonist. He just managed to keep his feet, and he struck a vain counter in the air. Then he was hit again under the jaw, and sprawled headlong on the ground. In another moment a knee compressed his diaphragm, and a couple of eager hands gripped his throat, but the grip of one was weaker than the other. He grasped the wrists, heard a cry of pain from the assailant, and then the spade of the navvy came whirling through the air above him, and struck something with a dull thud. He felt a drop of moisture on his face. The grip at his throat suddenly relaxed, and with a convulsive effort, Kemp loosed himself, grasped a limp shoulder, and rolled uppermost. He gripped the unseen elbows near the ground. "I've got him! Help me hold him! He's down! Hold his feet!" In another second there was a simultaneous rush upon the struggle, and a stranger coming into the road suddenly might have thought an exceptionally savage game of rugby was in progress. And there was no shouting after Kemp's cry, only a sound of blows and feet and heavy breathing. Then came a mighty effort, and the invisible man threw off a couple of antagonists and rose to his knees. Kemp clung to him in front like a hound to a stag, and a dozen hands gripped, clutched, and tore at the unseen. The tram conductor suddenly got the neck and shoulders and lugged him back. Down went the heap of struggling men again and rolled over. There was, I'm afraid, some savage kicking, and then suddenly a wild scream of "Mercy! Mercy!" that died down swiftly to a sound like choking. "Get back, you fools!" cried the muffled voice of Kemp, and there was a vigorous shoving at the back of stalwart forms. "He's hurt, I tell you! Stand back!" There was a brief struggle to clear a space, and then the circle of eager faces saw the doctor kneeling, as it seemed, 15 inches in the air and holding invisible arms to the ground. Behind him a constable gripped invisible ankles.
"But you leave go of him!"
cried the big navvy, holding a blood-stained spade.
"He's swimming!"
"He's not shamming," said the doctor, cautiously raising his knee, "and I'll hold him." His face was bruised and already going red. He spoke thickly because of a bleeding lip. He released one hand and seemed to be feeling at the face.
"The mouth's so wet,"
he said, and then,
"Good heavens!"
He stood up abruptly, and then knelt down on the ground by the side of the thing unseen. There was a pushing and shuffling, a sound of heavy feet as fresh people turned up to increase the pressure of the crowd. People now were crumbing out of the houses. The doors of the Jolly Cricketers stood suddenly wide open. Very little was said. Kemp felt about, his hands seeming to pass through empty air. He's not breathing. I can't feel his heart, his side. Suddenly, an old woman, peering under the arm of the big navvy, screamed sharply, "Lie there!" And she thrust out a wrinkled finger. And looking where she pointed, everyone saw, faint and transparent as though it was made of glass, so that veins and arteries and bones and nerves could be distinguished, the outline of a hand limp and prone. It grew clouded and opaque even as they stared.
"Hello!"
cried the constable.
"Here's his feet showing."
And so slowly, beginning at his hands and feet and creeping along his limbs to the vital centers of his body, that strange change continued. It was like the slow spreading of a poison. First came the little white nerves, a hazy gray sketch of a limb, then the glassy bones and intricate arteries, then the flesh and skin. First a faint fogginess, and then growing rapidly dense and opaque. Presently they could see his crushed chest and shoulders, and the dim outline of his drawn and battered features. When at last the crowd made way for Kemp to stand tall, there lay, naked and pitiful on the ground, the bruised and broken body of a young man about 30. His hair and brows were white, not grey with age, but white with the paleness of albinism, and his eyes were like garnets. His hands were clenched, his eyes wide open, and his expression was one of anger and dismay. "Cover his face," said a man.
"For heaven's sake, cover that face,"
said 3 children, pushing forward through the crowd. And they were suddenly twisted round and sent packing off again. Someone brought a sheet from the Jolly Cricketers, and having covered him, they carried him into that house. And there it was, on a shabby bed, in a tawdry, ill-lighted bedroom, surrounded by a crowd of ignorant and excited people, broken and wounded, betrayed and unpitied, that Griffin, the first of all men to make himself invisible, Griffin, the most gifted physicist the world had ever seen, ended in infinite disaster his strange and terrible career. And then comes the epilogue. So ends the story of the strange and evil experiments of the Invisible Man. And if you would learn more of him, you must go to a little inn near Port Stowe and talk to the landlord. The sign of the inn is an empty board, save for a hat and boots, and the name is the title of this story. The landlord is a short and corpulent little man with a nose of cylindrical proportions, wiry hair, and a sporadic rosiness of visage. Drink generously, and he'll tell you, generously, of all the things that happened to him after that time, and of how the lawyers tried to do him out of the treasure found upon him.
When they found they couldn't prove whose money was which, I was blessed. If they didn't try to make me out to be a bloomin' treasure trove, do it look like a treasure trove? And then a gentleman gave me a guinea a night to tell my story at the Empire Music, all to just tell him in my own words, barring one.
And if you want to cut off the flow of his reminiscences abruptly, you can always do so by asking if there weren't 3 manuscript books in his story. He admits there were and proceeds to explain, with asseverations, that everybody thinks he has 'em, but bless you, he hasn't.
The invisible man took him off to hide him when I cut and ran for Port Stowe. It's that Mr. Kemp put on with the idea, my idea of having him.
And then he would subside into a pensive state. He'd watch you furtively, bristle nervously with glasses, and presently leave the bar. He's a bachelor man, his tastes were ever bachelor, and there are no women folk in the house. Outwardly he buttons, it's expected of him, but in his more vital privacies, in the matter of braces, for example, he still turns to string. He conducts his house without enterprise, but with eminent decorum. His movements are slow, and he's a great thinker, but he has reputation for wisdom and a respectable parsimony in the village, and his knowledge of the roads of south of England would beat Cobbett. And on Sunday mornings, every Sunday morning, all the year round, while he's closed to the outer world, and every night after 10 he goes into his bar parlour, bearing a glass of gin faintly tinged with water, and having placed this down, he locks the door, and examines the blinds, and even looks under the table. Then, being satisfied of his solitude, he unlocks the cupboard and the box in the cupboard, and a drawer in that box, and produces 3 volumes bound in brown leather, and places them solemnly in the middle of the table. The covers are weather-worn and tinged with an owl green, for they once sojourned in a ditch, and some of the pages have been washed blank by dirty water. The landlord sits down in an armchair, fills a long clay pipe slowly, and he gloats over the books for a while. Then he pulls one towards him and opens it, begins to study it, turning over the leaves backwards and forwards. His brows are knit and his lips moon painfully.
Yes, a little too up in the air, cross and a fiddle-de-dee. But heavens, what a one he was for intellect.
Presently he relaxes and leans back, and blinks through his smoke across the room at things invisible to other eyes.
Full of secrets. Wonderful secrets. Once I get the hold of them, I won't do what he did. I'll just... well...
He pulls at his pipe, and so he lapses into a dream, the undying, wonderful dream of his life. And though Kemp has fished unceasingly, no human being save the landlord knows that those books are there, with a subtle secret of invisibility, and a dozen other strange secrets written therein. And none other will know of them until he dies. Alright, that's the story of the Invisible Man. That was a little bit more of a trek than I expected it to be. I expected to get that done in 2 episodes, but it wound up being 2.5. I have some short stories lined up for us, just to fill the rest of the time. They're also by H.G. Wells. We're gonna start with The Door on the Wall, I think, and we're gonna see how long The Door on the Wall takes us. It's literally just a collection of H.G. Wells short stories, so let's get into The Door on the Wall. One confidential evening, 3 months ago, Lionel Wallace told me this story of the door in the wall, and at the time I thought that so far as he was concerned, it was a true story. He told it to me with such a direct simplicity of conviction that I couldn't do otherwise than believe in him. But in the morning, in my own flat, I woke to a different atmosphere, and as I lay in bed and recalled the things he had told me, stripped of the glamour of his earnest, slow voice, denuded of the focused, shaded table light, the shadowy atmosphere that wrapped about him, and the pleasant, bright things, the desert and glasses and napery of the dinner we'd shared, making them for the time a bright little world cut off from everyday realities, I saw it all as, frankly, incredible.
"He was mystifying," I said. "How well he did it. It isn't quite the thing that I should have expected him of all people to do well."
Afterwards, as I sat up in bed and sipped my morning tea, I found myself trying to account for the flavor of reality that perplexed me in his impossible reminiscences, by supposing they did in some way suggest, present, convey, I hardly know which word to use, experiences it was otherwise impossible to tell. I don't resort to that explanation now. I've got over my intervening doubts. I believe now, as I believed at the moment of telling, that Wallace did, to the very best of his ability, strip the truth of his secret from me. But whether he himself saw, or only thought he saw, whether he himself was the possessor of an inestimable privilege, or the victim of a fantastic dream, I cannot pretend to guess. Even the facts of his death, which ended my doubts forever, throw no lights on that. That much the reader must judge for themselves. Would reader be plural here? I'm kind of trying to translate from the somewhat antiquated English. No, themself. Just one self. Yeah, that much the reader must judge for themselves. I forget now what chance comment or criticism of mine moved so reticent a man to confide in me. He was, I think, defending himself against an imputation of slackness and unreliability I had made in relation to a great public movement in which he had disappointed me. But he plunged suddenly. "I have," he said, "a preoccupation." "I know," he went on, after a pause that he devoted to the study of his cigar ash. "I've been negligent. But the fact is, it isn't a case of ghosts or apparitions, but it's an odd thing to tell of, Redmond. I'm haunted. I'm haunted by something that rather takes the light out of things, that fills me with longings." He paused, checked by that English shyness so often overcoming us when we would speak of moving or grave or beautiful things. "You were at St. Athelstan's all through," he said, and for a moment that seemed to me quite irrelevant. "Well," and he paused, and then very haltingly at first, but afterwards more easily, he began to tell of the thing that was hidden in his life, the haunting memory of a beauty and a happiness that filled his heart with insatiable longings that made all the interest and spectacle of worldly life seem dull and tedious and vain to him. Now that I have the clue to it, the thing seems written visibly in his face. I have a photograph in which that look of detachment has been caught and intensified. It reminds me of what a woman once said to him, a woman who had loved him greatly. "Suddenly the interest goes out of him. He forgets you. He doesn't care a rap for you under his very nose." Yet the interest was not always out of him, and when he was holding his attention to a thing, Wallace could contrive to be an incredibly successful man. His career, indeed, is set with successes. He left me behind him long ago. He soared up over my head and cut a figure in the world I couldn't cut anyhow. He was still a year short of 40, and they say now that he would have been in office, and very probably the new cabinet if he had lived. At school he always beat me without effort, as if it were by nature. We were at school together at St. Athelstan's College in West Kensington for almost all of our school time, you see. He came into the school as my equal, but left far above me, in a blaze of scholarships and brilliant performance. Yet I think I made a fair average running. And it was at school I heard first of the door in the wall, that I was to hear of a second time only a month before his death. To him, at least, the door in the wall was a real door, leading through a real wall to immortal realities. Of that I am now quite assured. And it came into his life early, when he was a little fellow, between 5 and 6. I remember how, as he sat making his confession to me with a slow gravity, that he reasoned and reckoned the date of it. There was a crimson Virginia creeper in it, all one bright uniform crimson, in a clear amber sunshine against the white wall. That came into the impression somehow, though I don't clearly remember how, and there were horse chestnut leaves upon the clean pavement outside the green door. They were blotched yellow and green, you know, not brown or dirty, so they must have been new fallen. I take it that means October. I look out for horse chestnut leaves every year, and I ought to know. If I'm right in that, I was about 5 years and 4 months old. He was, at least, he said, rather a precocious little boy. He learned to talk at an abnormally early age, and was so sane and old-fashioned, as people say, that he was permitted an amount of initiative that most children scarcely attain by 7 or 8. His mother died when he was born, and he was under the less vigilant and authoritative care of a nursery governess. His father was a stern, preoccupied lawyer who gave him little attention and expected great things of him. For all his brightness, he found life a little gray and dull. At least I think. And one day he wandered. He couldn't recall the particular neglect that enabled him to get away, nor the course he took among the West Kensington roads. All that had faded among the incurable blurs of memory. But the white wall and the green door stood out quite distinctly. As his memory of that remote childish experience ran, he did at the very first sight of that door experience a peculiar emotion, an attraction, a desire to get to the door and open it, and walk in. And at the same time he had the clearest conviction that either it was unwise or perhaps just wrong of him, he couldn't tell which, to yield to this attraction. He insisted upon it as a curious thing that he knew from the very beginning, unless his memories played him the strangest trick. The door was unfastened, that he could go in as he chose. I seemed to see the figure of that little boy, drawn and repelled, and it was very clear in his mind, too, though why it should be so was never explained, that his father would be very angry if he went through that door. Wallace described all these moments of hesitation to me with the utmost particularity. He went right past the door, and then, with his hands in his pockets and making an infantile attempt to whistle, strolled right along beyond the end of the wall. There he recalls a number of mean, dirty shops, and particularly that of a plumber and decorator, with a dusty disorder of earthenware pipes, sheet-lead ball-taps, patterned books of wallpaper, and tins of enamel. He stood, pretending to examine these things, and coveting, passionately desiring the green door. Then he said he had a gust of emotion. He made a run for it, lest hesitation should grip him again. He went plump, with outstretched hand, through the green door, and let it slam behind him. And so in a trice he came into the garden that has haunted all his life. It was very difficult for Wallace to give me his full sense of that garden into which he came. There was something in the very air of it that exhilarated, that gave one a sense of lightness and good happening and well-being. There was something in the sight of it that made all its color clean and perfect and subtly luminous. In the instant of coming into it, one was exquisitely glad, as only in rare moments and when young is young and joyful one can be glad in this world, and everything was beautiful there. Wallace mused before he went on, telling me. "You see," he said, with the doubtful inflection of a man who pauses at incredible things, "there were 2 great panthers there. Yes, spotted panthers, and I wasn't afraid, you see. There was a long, wide path with marble-edged flower borders on either side, and these 2 huge velvety beasts were playing there with a ball. One looked up and came toward me, a little curious as it seemed. It came right up to me, rubbed its soft round ear very gently against the small hand I had held out, and it purred. It was, I tell you, an enchanted garden, I know, and the size, oh! It stretched far and wide, this way and that. I believe there were hills far away. Heaven knows where West Kensington had suddenly gotten to, and somehow it was just like coming home. You know, in the very moment the door swung to behind me, I forgot the road with its fallen chestnut leaves, its cabs and tradesmen carts. I forgot the sort of gravitational pull back to the discipline and obedience of home. I forgot all hesitation and fear. Forgot discretion, forgot all the intimate realities of this life. I became in a moment a very glad and wonder-happy little boy, in another world. It was a world with a different quality, a warmer, more penetrating and mellower light, with a faint, clear gladness in the air, and wisps of sun-touched cloud in the blueness of its sky. And before me ran this long, wide path, invitingly, with weedless beds on either side, rich with untended flowers, and these 2 great panthers. I put my little hands fearlessly on their soft fur, and caressed their round ears and sensitive corners under their ears, and played with them, and it was as though they welcomed me home. There was a keen sense of homecoming in my mind, and presently a tall, fair girl appeared in the pathway and came to meet me, smiling, and said, "Well?" to me, and lifted me, and gave me a... Well, she put me down and led me by the hand. There was no amazement, but only an impression of delightful rightness, of being reminded of happy things that had in some way been overlooked. There were broad steps, I remember, that came into view between spikes of delphinium, and up these we went to a great avenue, between very old and shady dark trees. All down this avenue, you know, between the red chap stems, were marble seats of honor and statuary, and very tame and friendly white doves. And along this avenue, this girl led me, looking down. I recall the pleasant lines, the finely modeled chin of her sweet face, asking me questions in a soft, agreeable voice, and telling me things, pleasant things, I know, though what they were I was never able to recall. And presently a little monkey, very clean, with fur already brown and kindly hazel eyes, came down a tree to us, and ran beside me, looking up at me and grinning, and presently leapt to my shoulder. So we went on our way in our great happiness. And at this he paused. "Go on." "I remember little things. We passed an old man musing among laurels, I remember, in a place just filled with parakeets, and came through a broad shaded colonnade to a spacious cool palace, full of pleasant fountains, full of beautiful things, full of the quality and promise of my heart's desire. And there were many things and many people, some that still seem to stand out clearly, and some that are a little vague, but all these people were beautiful and kind. In some way, I don't know how, it was conveyed to me that they all were kind to me, glad to have me there, and filling me with gladness by their gestures, by the touch of their hands, by the welcome and love in their eyes. Yes." He mused for a while. "Playmates I found there. That was very much to me, because I was a lonely little boy. They played delightful games in a grass-covered court, where there was a sundial set about with flowers, and as one played one loved. But it's odd. There's a gap in my memory. I don't remember the games we played. I never remembered. Afterwards, as a child, I spent long hours trying, even to the point of tears, to recall that form of that happiness. I wanted to play it all over again in my nursery by myself. But no. All I could remember was the happiness in two dear playfellows who were most with me. And then presently came a somber, dark woman, with a grave, pale face and dreamy eyes, a somber woman wearing a long, soft robe of pale purple, who carried a book and beckoned, and took me aside with her into a gallery above a hall, though my playmates were loath to have me go, and ceased their game and stood watching as I was carried away. "Come back to us," they cried. "Come back to us soon." I looked up at her face, but she heeded them not at all. Her face was very gentle and grave. She took me to a seat in the gallery, and I stood beside her, ready to look at her book as she opened it upon her knee. The pages fell open, and she pointed. I looked, marveling, for in the living pages of that book I saw myself. It was a story about myself, and in it were all the things that had happened to me ever since I was born. It was wonderful to me because the pages of that book were not pictures, you understand, but realities. Wallace paused gravely, and he looked at me doubtfully. "Go on, I understand." "They were realities, yes. They must have been. People moved, and things came and went in them. My dear mother, whom I'd near forgotten, and then my father, stern and upright, the servants, the nursery, all the familiar things of home. Then the front door, and the busy streets with traffic to and fro. I looked and marvelled, and looked half doubtfully again into the woman's face, and turned the pages over, skipping this and that, to see more of this book and more, and so at last I came to myself, hovering and hesitating, outside the green door and the long white wall, and felt again the conflict and the fear. "And next?" I cried, and would have turned on. Wow, that was really awkward. I thought it was the dude. No, it's the dude as a little kid. "And next?" I cried, and would have turned on, but the cool hand of the grave woman delayed me. Next, I insisted, and struggled gently with her hand, pulling up her fingers with all my childish strength, and as she yielded and the page came over, she bent down upon me like a shadow, and kissed my brow. But the page didn't show the enchanted garden, nor the panthers, nor the girl that had led me by the hand, nor the playfellows who had been so loath to let me go. It showed a long grey street in West Kensington, on that chill hour of afternoon before the lamps are lit, and I was there, a wretched little figure, weeping aloud, for all that I could do to restrain myself, and I was weeping because I couldn't return to my dear playfellows who had called after me, "Come back to us." I was there. This was no page in a book, but harsh reality, that enchanted place in the restraining hand of the grave mother at whose knee I had stood had gone. Whither have they gone? He halted again and remained for a time, staring into the fire. Oh, the wretchedness of that return! Well, poor little wretch I was, brought back to this grey world again. As I realized the fullness of what had happened to me, I gave way to quite ungovernable grief, and the shame and humiliation of that public weeping and my disgraceful homecoming remain with me still. I see again the benevolent-looking old gentleman in gold spectacles who stopped and spoke to me, prodding me first with his umbrella. "Poor little chap, are you lost then?" And me, a London boy of 5 and more, and he must needs bring in a kindly young policeman and make a crowd of me and so march me home. Sobbing, conspicuous and frightened, I came from the enchanted garden to the steps of my father's house. That is as well as I can remember my vision of that garden, the garden that haunts me still. Of course I can convey nothing of that indescribable quality of translucent unreality, that difference from the common things of experience that hung about it all, but that's what happened. If it was a dream, I'm sure it was a daytime and altogether extraordinary dream. Naturally, there followed a terrible questioning by my aunt, my father, the nurse, the governess, everyone. I tried to tell them, and my father gave me my first thrashing for telling lies. When afterwards I tried to tell my aunt, she punished me again for my wicked persistence. And then, as I said, everyone was forbidden to listen to me, to hear a word about it. Even my fairy tale books were taken away from me for a time, because I was too imaginative. Yes, they did that. My father belonged to the old school. And my story was driven back upon myself. I whispered it to my pillow that was often damp and salt to my whispering lips with childish tears. And I added always to my official and less fervent prayers this one heartfelt request. Please God, I may dream of the garden. Oh, take me back to the garden, take me back to my garden. I dreamt often of it. I may have added to it. I may have changed it, I don't know. All this, you understand, is an attempt to reconstruct from fragmentary memories of very early experience. Between that and the other consecutive memories of my boyhood there's a gulf. A time came when it seemed impossible I should ever speak of that wonder glimpse again. At this point I asked an obvious question. No, I don't remember that I ever attempted to find my way back to the garden in these early years. It seems odd to me now, but I think that very probably a closer watch was kept on my movements after this misadventure, to prevent my going astray. No, it wasn't until you knew me that I tried for the garden again. And I believe there was a period, incredible as it seems now, when I forgot the garden altogether. When I was about 8 or 9, it may have been. Do you remember me as a kid at St. Althesians? Rather. I didn't show any signs, did I, in those days of having a secret dream? And he looked up with a sudden smile. Did you ever play Northwest Passage with me? No, of course, you didn't come my way. It was the sort of game that every imaginative child plays all day. The memory was a discovery of a Northwest Passage to school. The way to school was plain enough. The game consisted in finding some way that wasn't plain, starting off 10 minutes early in some hopeless direction, and working one's way around toward unaccustomed streets, to my goal. And one day I got entangled among some rather low-class streets on the other side of Camden Hill, and I began to think that for once the game would be against me, that I should get to school late. I had tried rather desperately a street that seemed a cul-de-sac and found a passage at the end. I hurried through that with a renewed hope. I shall do it yet, I said, and passed a row of frowsy little shops that were inexplicably familiar to me. And behold, there was my white wall and the green door that led to the garden. The thing whacked upon me suddenly. Then after all, that garden, that wonderful garden, it wasn't a dream. I suppose my second experience with the green door marks the world of difference there is between the busy life of a schoolboy and the infinite leisure of a child. Anyhow, this second time, I didn't for a moment think of going in straight away. You see, for one thing, my mind was full of the idea of getting to school on time, set on not breaking my record for punctuality. I must surely have felt some little desire at least to try the door. Yes, I must have felt that. But I seem to remember the attraction of the door mainly as another obstacle to my overmastering destination to get to school. I was immediately interested by this discovery I had made, of course, and I went on with my mind full of it, but I went on. It didn't check me. I ran past, tugging out my watch, found I had 10 minutes to spare, then I was going downhill into familiar surroundings. I got to school, breathless, it's true, and wet with perspiration, but in time. I can remember hanging up my coat and hat. Went right by it and left it behind me. Odd, He looked at me thoughtfully. Of course, I didn't know then that it wouldn't always be there. Schoolboys have limited imaginations. I suppose I thought it was an awfully jolly thing to have it there, to know my way back to it, but there was the school tugging at me. I expect I was a good deal distraught and inattentive that morning, recalling what I could of the beauty of the strange people that I should presently see again. Oddly enough, I had no doubt in my mind they'd be glad to see me. Yes, I must have thought of the garden that morning just as a jolly sort of place to which one might resort in the interludes of a strenuous scholastic career. I didn't go on that day at all. The next day was a half-holiday, and that may have weighed with me. Perhaps, too, my state of inattention brought down impositions upon me and docked the margin of time necessary for the detour. I didn't know. What I do know is that in the meantime the enchanted garden was so much upon my mind I couldn't keep it to myself. I told... what was his name? A ferrety-looking youngster. We called him Squiff. Young Hopkins. Hopkins it was. I didn't like telling him. I had a feeling in some way it was against the rules to tell him, but I did. He was walking part of the way home with me. He was talkative. And if we hadn't talked about the enchanted garden, we should have talked of something else. And it was intolerable to me to think about any other subject. So I blabbed. He told my secret. The next day in the play interval, I found myself surrounded by half a dozen large boys, half teasing and wholly curious to hear more of the enchanted garden. There was that big Fawcett, you remember him? And Carnaby and Morley Reynolds. You weren't there by any chance? No, I think I'd have remembered if you were there. A boy is a creature of odd feelings. I really believe, in spite of my secret self-disgust, a little flattered to have the attention of these big fellows. I remember particularly a moment of pleasure caused by the praise of Crenshaw. You remember Crenshaw, Major, the son of Crenshaw, the composer? Yes, he said it was the best lie he'd ever heard. But at the same time, there was a really painful undertow of shame at telling what I felt was indeed a sacred secret. The beast Fawcett made a joke about the girl in green. Wallace's voice shrank with the keen memory of that shame. I pretended not to hear. Well, then Carnaby suddenly called me a young liar and disputed with me when I said the thing was true. I said I knew where to find the green door, could lead them all there in 10 minutes. Carnaby became outrageously virtuous and said I'd have to, and bear out my words or suffer. Did you ever have Carnaby twist your arm? Then perhaps you'd understand how it went with me. I swore my story was true. There was nobody in the school to save a chap from Carnaby through Crenshaw. Put in a word or so. Carnaby got his game, and I grew excited and red-eared and a little frightened, and I behaved altogether like a silly little chap, and the outcome of it all was that instead of starting alone for my enchanted garden, I led the way presently, cheeks flushed, ears hot, eyes smarting, and my soul one burning misery and shame, for a party of 6 mocking, curious, and threatening schoolfellows. We never did find the white wall and the green door. You mean? I mean I couldn't find it. I would have found it if I could. And afterwards, when I could go alone, I couldn't find it. I never found it. I seem now to have been always looking for it through my schoolboy days, but I never came upon it again. Did the fellows make it disagreeable? Oh, beastly disagreeable. Carnaby held a council over me for wanton lying. I remember how I snuck home and upstairs to hide the marks of my blubbering. But when I cried myself to sleep at last, it wasn't for Carnaby, but for the garden, for that beautiful afternoon I'd hoped for the sweet friendly women and the waiting playfellows, and the game I'd hoped to learn again, that beautiful forgotten game. I believed firmly that if I had not told, I had had times after that, crying at night and wool-gathering by day. For 2 terms I slackened and had bad reports. Do you remember? Of course you would. It was you. Your beating me in mathematics that brought me back to the grind again. For a time my friend stared silently into the red heart of the fire. Then he said, I never saw it again until I was 17. It leapt upon me for the 3rd time as I was driving to Paddington on my way to Oxford and a scholarship. I had just one momentary glimpse. I was leaning over the apron of my hansom smoking a cigarette, and no doubt thinking myself no end of a man of the world. And suddenly there was the door, the wall, the dear sense of unforgettable and still attainable things. We clattered by, I too taken by surprise, to stop my cab until we were well past and round a corner. Then I had a strange moment, a double and divergent moment of my will. I tapped the little door in the roof of the cab, and brought my arm down to pull out my watch. "Yes, sir," said the cabman smartly. Well, it's nothing," I cried. "My mistake. We haven't much time. Go on." And he went on. I got my scholarship, and the night after I was told of that, I sat over my fire in my little upper room, my study in my father's house, with his praise, his rare praise, and his sound counsels ringing in my ears. And I smoked my favorite pipe, the formidable bulldog of adolescence, and thought of that door and the long white wall. If I had stopped, I thought, I should have missed my scholarship, I should have missed Oxford, muddle all the fine career before me. I begin to see things better. I fell musing deeply, but I did not then this career of mine was a thing that merited sacrifice. Or rather, I missed a word there. But I didn't doubt then this career of mine was a thing that merited sacrifice. Those dear friends and that clear atmosphere seemed very sweet to me, very fine, but remote. My grip was fixing now upon the world. I saw another door opening, the door of my career. He stared again into the fire. Its red lights picked out a stubborn strength in his face for just one flickering moment, and then it vanished again. Well, and he sighed at this, I've served that career. I've done much work, much hard work. But I've dreamt of the enchanted garden 1,000 dreams, and seen its door, or at least glimpsed its door, 4 times since then, yes. 4 times. For a while, this world was so bright and interesting, seemed so full of meaning and opportunity by that half-faced charm of the garden, who was by comparison gentle and remote. Who wants to pat panthers on the way to dinner with pretty women and distinguished men? I came down to London from Oxford, a man of bold promise that I have done something to redeem. something. And yet there have been disappointments. Twice I've been in love. I won't dwell on that, but once, as I went to someone who I know doubted whether I dared to come, I took a short-cut at a venture through an unfrequented road near Earl's Court, and so happened on the white wall and the familiar green door. Odd, I said to myself, but I thought this place was on Campden Hill. It's the place I never could find somehow, like counting Stonehenge, the place of that queer daydream of mine. And I went by it intent upon my purpose. It had no appeal to me that afternoon. I had just a moment's impulse to try the door. 3 steps aside were needed at most, though I was sure enough in my heart it would open to me. Then I thought that doing so might delay me on the way to that appointment which I thought my honor was involved. Afterwards I was sorry for my punctuality. I might at least have peeped in, I thought, and waved a hand to those panthers, but I knew enough by this time to not seek again belatedly that which is not found by seeking. Yes, that time made me very sorry. Years of hard work after that, and never a sight of the door. It's only recently come back to me. With it there's come a sense as though some thin tarnish had spread itself over my world. I began to think of it as a sorrowful and bitter thing that I should never see that door again. Perhaps I was suffering a little from overwork. Perhaps it was what I had heard spoken of as the feeling of 40. I don't know. But certainly the keen brightness that makes effort easy has gone out of those things recently. And that just at a time with all these new political developments, when I ought to be working. Odd, isn't it? But I do begin to find life toilsome, its rewards as I come near them cheap. I began a little while ago to want the garden, quite badly. Yes, and I've seen it 3 times. The garden? No, the door, and I haven't gone in. He leaned over the table to me with an enormous sorrow in his voice as he spoke. Thrice I've had my chance. Thrice. If ever that door offers itself to me again, I swore I'll go in out of this dust and heat, out of this dry glitter of vanity, out of these toilsome futilities. I will go and never return. This time I will stay. I swore it, and when the time came, I didn't go. 3 times in 1 year I've passed that door and failed to enter. 3 times in the past year. The first time was on the night of the Snatch Division, on the Tenants' Redemption Bill, on which the government was saved by a majority of 3. You remember? No one on our side, perhaps very few on the opposite side, expected the end that night. Then the debate collapsed like eggshells. I and Hotchkiss... I'm sorry, what? Hotchkiss? It's like Hotchkiss? There we go. I don't know what was bent out of shape in my brain there. I and Hotchkiss were dining with his cousin at Brentford. We were both unpaired, and we were called up by telephone, set off at once in his cousin's motor. We got in barely in time, and on the way we passed my walled-in door, livid in the moonlight, splotched with hot yellow as the glare of our lamps lit it, but unmistakable. "My God!" I cried. "What?" said Hotchkiss. "Nothing," I answered, and the moment passed. "I've made a great sacrifice," I told the whip as they got in. "They all have," he said, and hurried by. I don't see how I could have done otherwise then. And the next occasion was as I rushed to my father's bedside to bid that stern old man farewell. Then, too, the claims of life were imperative, but the 3rd time was different. It happened a week ago. It fills me with hot remorse to recall it. I was with Gurker and Ralph's. It's no secret now, you know I've had my talk with Gurker. We'd been dining at Frobisher's, and the talk had become intimate between us. The question of my place in the reconstructed ministry lay always just over the boundary of the discussion. Yes, that's all settled. It needn't be talked about it yet, but there's no reason to keep it a secret from you. Yes, thanks. But let me tell you my story. Then on that night, Things were very much in the air. My position was a very delicate one. I was keenly anxious to get some definite word from Gurker, but I was hampered by Ralph's presence. I was using the best power of my brain to keep that light and careless talk not too obviously directed to that point that concerns me. I had to. Ralph's behavior since has more than justified my caution. Ralph's, I knew, would leave us beyond the Kensington High Street, and I could surprise Gurker by a sudden frankness. One has sometimes to resort to these little devices. And then it was that in the margin of my field of vision I became aware once more of the white wall and the green door before us. Down the road. We passed it, talking. I passed it. I can still see the shadow of Gurker's marked profile, his opera hat tilted forward over his nose, the many folds of his neck wrap going before my shadow and Ralph's as he sauntered past. I passed within 20 inches of the door. If I say good night to them and go in, I ask myself what'll happen. And I was all a tingle for that word with Gurker. I couldn't answer that question in the tangle of my other problems. They'll think me mad, and suppose I vanish now, I thought. Amazing disappearance of a prominent politician. That weighed with me. 1,000 inconceivably petty worldlinesses weighed with me in that crisis. Then he turned on me with a sorrowful smile and spoke slowly. Here I am. Here I am, and my chance has gone from me. 3 times in 1 year that door has been offered me, the door that goes into peace, into delight, into a beauty beyond dreaming, a kindness no man on earth can know, and I've rejected it, Redmond, and it is gone. How do you know? I know. I'm left now to work it out, to stick to the tasks that held me so strongly when my moments came. You say I have success, this vulgar, tawdry, irksome, envied thing. I have it. He had a walnut in his big hand. If that was my success, he said, and crushed it, and held it out for me to see. Let me tell you something, Redmond. This loss is destroying me for 2 months, 10 weeks nearly now. I've done no work at all except the most necessary and urgent duties. My soul is full of inappeasable regrets. At nights when it's less likely I shall be recognized, I go out, I wander. Yes, I wonder what people would think of that if they knew. A cabinet minister, the responsible head of that most vital of all departments, wandering alone, grieving, sometimes audibly lamenting for a door, a garden. I can still see now his rather pallid face and the unfamiliar somber fire that had come into his eyes. I see him very vividly tonight. I sit recalling his words, his tones, and last evening's Westminster Gazette still lies on my sofa, containing the notice of his death. At lunch today the club was busy with him in the strange riddle of his fate. They found his body very early yesterday morning in a deep excavation near East Kensington Station. It's one of the 2 shafts that have been made in connection with an extension of the railway southward. It's protected from the intrusion of the public by a hoarding upon the high road, in which a small doorway has been cut for the convenience of some of the workmen who live in that direction. The doorway was left unfastened through a misunderstanding between 2 gangers, and through it he made his way. My mind is darkened with questions and riddles. It would seem he walked all the way from the house that night. He's frequently walked home during the past session, and so it is I figure his dark form coming upon the late and empty streets wrapped up in tent. Did the pale electric lights near the station cheat the rough planking into a semblance of white? Did that fatal unfastened door awaken some memory? Was there, after all, any green door in the wall at all? I don't know. I've told his story as he told it to me. There are times when I believe that Wallace was no more than the victim of a coincidence between a rare but not unprecedented type of hallucination and a careless trap, but that indeed is not my profoundest belief. You may think me superstitious, if you will, and foolish, but indeed I am more than half convinced that he had, in truth, an abnormal gift, and a sense of something, I know not what, that in the guise of the wall and door offered him an outlet, a secret and peculiar passage of escape into another and altogether more beautiful world. At any rate, will you say, it betrayed him in the end. But did it betray him? There you touched the inmost discovery of these dreamers, these men of vision and the imagination. We see our world fair and common, the hoarding and the pit. By our daylight standard, he walked out of security into darkness, danger, and death. But did he see like that? Alright, that was The Door in the Wall by H.G. Wells. That's all I have for this evening. I'm about 30 minutes over my usual time. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. Next time on Dragon Ball Z. No. Next time we come back, we'll be digging into the Phantom of the Opera, which I'm really looking forward to. I've been a massive fan of the stage play since early childhood, practically. And I decided that the novelization needs read, and that's what's going to come up next. After that, I don't know. I know in March, for sure, speaking of things I'm very fond of as a child, in March we're going to absolutely do The Secret Garden. Just because that was actually one of the first books I learned to read with. So it's very near and dear to me, and so therefore it should go on during Childhood Games Month. You know, the month that's centered around Small Michael. But anyway, this has been Paper Cuts. Before I do the outro, I lied. Go vote in the Frozen Tundra Finds poll. There should be a link in the description. If I forgot to put it there, just go to my channel and it'll be in the Frozen Tundra Finds playlist. Just go vote, please. It makes my life 100,000% easier when you guys go vote for the Frozen Tundra Finds poll, because then I don't have to make an executive decision on what to play. I can get an idea of what you, the viewer, wants to see. As an extension to that, if you have a book you want to hear on this here program, feel free to send me an email, comment on a video, reach out to me. I exist in many places over the internet. Feel free to reach out to me and suggest a book. If it's not in the public domain, I'll reply to you and say, I'm sorry, this isn't in the public domain. I don't think I can do it. Or I can, or you could maybe put me in touch with the author so I can ask. I don't know. That's something I've been thinking about. But do try to make sure they're in the public domain. Anything before 1923 is valid in the States. So, anyway, that's enough blithering. That's enough promotion. This has been Paper Cuts. I hope it didn't sting.